The many skyscrapers of New York City, the incredible, impeccable megalopolis on the east coast of the United States, a city that happens to be situated on the world's largest natural harbor, or at least one of the world's largest natural harbors. And when we look at it, we see a eclectic mix of modern structures with old world structures, and of course with our great glass and steel towers that reach to the sky. Although I have to say they're certainly not locations I would seek refuge in the event of any sort of natural disaster. What's really the account, though, with New York City? Why is it this impressive megalopolis of 8 million people with 5 distinct boroughs grew up in a very short amount of time? What's its significance for understanding the old world and the principles of the theories with the concept of Tartaria and the civilization that preceded ours? How is it that New York City is a nexus point? Why do we have so many different incredible structures? And everyone who resides in New York City or visits always comes across the sign that you are no doubt entering a true land of liberty. And make no mistakes about it, this is a land of liberty. Join me as we explore New York City, Reset Center 1. New York City's status as the largest natural harbor in the world, or at least one of the largest, is no doubt one of its main points to understand as to why this would be a great city. Indeed, it is still the greatest city in the United States, the most populous with over 8 million people, nearly 2 times the size of Los Angeles, or the City of the Angels, a very apt name for the city in Southern California. But how exactly did this come to be? Most people think of Manhattan when they think of New York City, although there are 5 distinct boroughs: Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and of course the often forgotten Staten Island. What was the origin of New York City? We understand that it was originally a Dutch settlement and Fort Amsterdam from the original maps. And yet with our questioning of our official historical account, we have to wonder exactly what the origin was. Why is it this particular city constantly comes up as the center point for understanding the United States? There are many overlapping coincidences for what makes New York significant. Beyond the fact that it is the main port of entry, if you will, for the United States, always has been, and it seems like it always will be. The United Nations just happens to be headquartered within New York City. And it also has the status as being the financial capital of the entire land, or the world, however you want to say it. It's anchored by Wall Street in the financial district within Manhattan. It's considered the largest metropolitan economy in the world, and it also just happens to be the residence of the most billionaires at this time, and millionaires of any city within the world. How exactly, though, do we have this very unique history of the plan of New York City? And when we look at many of the early maps, whether it's the original layout map, and how anyone can know that, I always find that fascinating, of the Dutch settlement of Fort Amsterdam in the 1600s, and you may recall there was a TV show with Jamie Lannister himself called New Amsterdam. I can't say it was a very enjoyable one, but that's just my opinion. Looking, though, at these early maps, we have the impression, it seems, that New York City, much like every other city and town across the United States, seems to have had a very definitive plan. And when you look at the early maps, I'm oftentimes surprised by just how densely populated the city seems to have been, especially Manhattan Island itself. Now, is this just because of good urban planning from the very start? Certainly somebody saw that this was one of the world's largest natural harbors, and they knew that the city was going to have a very impeccable history behind it, even in the past. People were looking ahead, they were prescient in a way. Or is there an entirely different explanation for why we have these very elaborate maps that are incredibly detailed and seem to show planning with a density in terms of structures and even an existing infrastructure? Is it possible that New York City and its 5 boroughs were actually remnants or surviving portions of an old world entire city? And it could have in fact been the most intact. Because one of the things that we tend to overlook when we look at our historical account of the United States is, when exactly did we go through all the difficulty of constructing these cities and these towns? Official history tells us that most of the work was done in the 1800s. Virtually every city and town in the United States had the lion's share of the work of establishing its infrastructure. In other words, making a city or town self-sustaining. You need to have water, you need to have food, you need to have a well-developed logistics system. Ah, yes, logistics. That entire concept that we often hand-wave away when we talk about how these incredible structures were built by a logistically limited society in the 1800s. Because as we understand it, there was horse and buggy, and to a lesser extent, there were trains. Oh, yes, that impressive train infrastructure system that seemed to be built very quickly and very rapidly. Now, maybe it happened as we thought, but going back to the theory of New York City being Reset Center 1, let's look at our population chart here. And we see that New York City became the largest city in the United States from 1790, a distinction it continues to this day. And it's also worth noting that even by the mid-1800s or 1850, when so many things all seem to just randomly begin, I'm sure that's another coincidence, the population was stated to be 500,000. There's also other interesting overlapping details about New York City. The entire orphan train program for the United States was facilitated through New York City. Again, the official history says there were just so many orphans running around New York City. Even though if you ever read into the history and understand the society at that time, it never made a lot of sense. Looking at New York City's evolving skyline, we understand that the first skyscrapers were constructed in the 1890s. It's also interesting to note that not many structures were really built all the way through the rest of the 20th century. In other words, the account we have seems to indicate that most of the skyscrapers were built in the early portion of the 20th century. And then once we got past the Great Depression, not too many structures were constructed. Yes, a few notable ones were, but it really wasn't until more recent times that we started building all these very impressive pencil skyscrapers. Now, I know it's all a matter of taste, and yes, I certainly don't want to denigrate the design plans of the new modern pencil skyscrapers, and they look so incredible. But when you look in the history of New York City, you see that it seems to have included many impressive structures that you wouldn't expect to see, such as these numerous armories, these incredible castles. And the reason I find this little detail very fascinating is that these armories have shown up in many cities all across the United States, and yes, they clearly look like castles. And the reason that they're stated to look like castles is because they were defensive fortifications for the militias at the time. And there were many militias that were required in New York City throughout its time frame and existence, but I'm also intrigued by the fact that they managed to build these impressive structures, and many of them do survive to this day. They include architectural detailings that seem to go beyond what we'd expect to see in a very densely packed city. And whether we're saying it's a densely compressed population or just simply dense urban structures that have a more vertical nature to them. And of course, if you live in New York City or you visit it to this day, that's one of the first things that you'll notice. It is very much a vertical existence. Even Los Angeles, despite the fact that it has about half the population of New York City, does not share its same vertical nature. And of course, it does not have its infrastructure in terms of having a subway. Yes, Los Angeles has a subway, but it's certainly nowhere near as extensive or as accessible as the subway in New York City, which you can ride to visit these very impressive armories that still exist in many places to this day. Now, who actually went to the effort, and how did they go about building these armories? The armories always interest me because of the fact that they are located in many unique areas. For example, you'll often find armories in the United States universities. For example, the armory at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. It's where their basketball team used to play their basketball games, and the building still exists to this day. You even remember the example at The Ohio State University with their impressive castle armory. And yet there are many castle armories, such as this one in New York City. Look at that nice M60 main battle tank out in front of it. Isn't that just a wonderful overlapping of history right there? But it really gives you the impression that there had to be something more than what we understand with the official history of New York City. Why are there all these castles? Why would anybody go to the trouble of building these castles that seem to be right in the middle of the city? If the desire was to defend the city, wouldn't you want to build the castles at least on the perimeter of the city? Oh no, we're going to build it right in the middle of the city. And of course you can try to explain it by saying, well, it was during the time of expansion. But yet we look at the earlier maps and the earlier plans, and it gives us the impression that this was already a built-out city, just looking at Manhattan Island, to say nothing of the other 4 boroughs. So what's really the history behind it? Why is it that we have these impressive towers with these very unique parapets where if one were so inclined, you could film your next Deathstalker movie and show the final duel between Deathstalker and Troxardus, such as on that tower there. Who exactly would go about building a tower like that just for an armory in the middle of the city anyway? Trying to consider all military applications for it doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of the interior images that we have of these armories are no less impressive. They show very large formation areas that have seats around them, so I guess people could watch the formations and the parades indoors. Imagine that. Well, I guess you always have your inclement weather plan available if you're going to do your final pass and review parade, if you are indeed a military formation. But there always seems to be a different number of explanations for how these structures could have been used, as though they could have had a variety of different purposes. Could this have once been a hangar of some sort? It almost looks like it was supposed to be a hangar, but maybe that's just my imagination running wild with me. And yet you'll see that same detail that's reflected in many of these armories, as though they were very ubiquitous, all over the city, and I'm just going to come out and say it, I have a theory that perhaps these armories were actually there, and older structures that were repurposed to be used by the new force that was occupying the city. And of course, we always have that same terminology, occupy this, occupy that. But if you think about this, whether you want to think of this as an early colonization, I always found it intriguing that the Dutch, despite the fact that they discovered and built the first Fort Amsterdam, just decided to leave what is the greatest or one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. Well, I'm sure there's economic reasons behind it. That's always intriguing when you try to overlay all the economic mentality that comes around New York City to this day. You have the New York Stock Exchange, you have the NASDAQ, and everyone realizes that all the greatest financial transactions of the land occur in New York City. Officially, it's also one of the most international cities in the land, where you have 800 of the 7,000 to 9,000 languages in the land, depending on which sources you consult, spoken in one single city. And so its more international character is something that if you don't live in New York City, you don't interact with every day. And yet it's very much there. Deconflicted with the fact that we have all these armories. And so these details alone give us the impression that there is a lot to this theory that this really was Reset Center 1. That New York City, its entire infrastructure, and whatever name it originally had, and that's certainly not relevant now, were actually a series of surviving structures with the supporting infrastructure from before the last reset. Therefore, it was very, very easy to reestablish a civilization in this area where it was already existing, that already had the infrastructure that was capable of sustaining the population. And when you look at the fact that there were many different orphanages, asylums, all the institutions and structures that were required to support this mentality or this process of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. The same process that we've seen repeated throughout all of our explorations. For example, look at this particular asylum, this octagonal building with its very impressive dome. How exactly could anyone actually explain or justify constructing a structure as elaborate and detailed as this, just for the sole purpose of being any sort of asylum? And of course, our official history tells us that asylums had a multitude of purposes in the 1800s. Yes, of course, we're well aware of how they were designated for the mentally ill at the time, but when you look at all the reasons, the official reasons for why one could be admitted to an asylum, it varies from everything of spousal difficulties to someone just simply not liking you, or maybe somebody just wants to get you out of the way and they could send you to an asylum. And that's not me being facetious. You can actually look up the reasons for people being committed to asylums, and you'll see that it includes everything. I wonder if there was a reason that said, conduct unbecoming a citizen of the United States. You know, that's kind of the catch-all that they have. And strangely enough, it survives in the parlance of the Uniform Code of Military Justice for the United States military. But looking at this particular octagonal asylum, why would anyone design an asylum with very windy staircases? And it even includes impressive columns. This is the prime example that we have of a structure that was apparently built for the purpose of housing people who had challenges with fitting in with society, people who we understand to be aberrations in terms of conforming to the rules of society. And yet for these people who have these challenges, we're going to give them a very complex structure that seems to be very difficult to get around. And I know the explanation will be, there were simply no safety standards. Nobody was thinking about safety. Safety is the answer to everything in our modern society and our civilization. And that may be true. Of course, another perspective will tell you that safety is merely the overall guiding reason given not to do something. Not to do really anything, because, it might be unsafe for me to even get out of my bed in the morning. Of course, you're not living your life, but, we don't need to have that discussion. But looking at these columns and these elaborate staircases and every bit of decoration, you really have to question what the original intention and purpose of this very elaborate structure originally was. And one of the surviving asylums, as it still stands to this day, it stands out in a way that really causes us to question the actual existence of this previous civilization. Because how could you really defend this during this time when you have a new nation, a new state, and what we're informed is a rapidly expanding city? It seemed to be, though, that New York City was designated from the very start of the United States to be the primary nexus point of the nation. And you could even argue that it's the primary nexus point of the entire world. The financial system is here. And whether we want to say that the financial system is merely an implement of control or it's just the means of facilitating our current civilization, was it different in previous civilizations? We really don't know. Official history tells us that there's always been money, and even before money there was the barter system, and there's really no other way to think about things. That may be true, or that might be highly questionable. But we can certainly see in the remnants and the ruins of these structures that, once again, they've gone through a process of renovation. And so can we really take what we see at face value? It's one of the little details about New York City that I've always found most interesting about it, whatever I've visited in person, is actually trying, especially since I have the eyes that I have now, to deconflict what you see with the more modern structures and the legitimate old world structures. The number of small islands that are around Manhattan Island, such as Blackwell's Island, which is the location of this octagonal asylum that we just looked at. Why is it there were so many structures such as this in these facilities that are on these islands? I won't say anything about Rikers Island because I think we've already hit the nail on the head that, yes, when you enter this area, you're reminded that you're really entering a land of liberty. We won't say anything about the current percentage of incarcerated population of the United States. There's no need to. But was it all a design from the start? These asylums, this surviving infrastructure in New York City that's always been with us, that we have this port of entry, if you will. And when you look at this from a military perspective, anytime we understand military operations or a campaign, which the United States has the largest and most expeditionary capable military in the land today, you have to establish what's called a sea port of debarkation. And now, of course, in modern times with flying devices, planes, and so on and so forth, you also have an air port of debarkation. This is a main entry point. And is it possible that this entire city with its 5 boroughs was designated as Reset Center 1? That this was going to be the entry point for the entire United States? This infrastructure, these asylums that were so numerous, very well documented, very well recorded. You can look up the history of all the various asylums that they had across the 5 boroughs. And you can see that they had different designated purposes. We had orphan asylums. We had soldier asylums. We had asylums for virtually anything and everything else that you could think of. And every single one of these structures is massive, elaborately built, and seems to take up the area of an entire city block. And that's very impressive to me, especially considering how compressed and dense the plan was for the original city and how it passed over time. It's always been very densely populated. Of course, if you just go outside of New York City, you'll find that you have open land as far as the eye can see. And it's no coincidence that this particular area is featured and referenced in many times. I think of the movie Failsafe, where the accidental nuclear bombing of Moscow, and then in the plot of the movie, the president doesn't offer up Washington, D.C. to sacrifice, he offers up New York City, because it's the economic powerhouse of the United States. You would think it would be a national capital for a national capital. There's all the images that we have and the references of the entire orphan system, and I think about the orphan trains that originated from the city and its major port. It does make sense from that perspective, and it does support the official history. Yet when you take it along with the immigration coming through New York City, and the fact that all the adults and all the children all started at this nexus point, it supports the theory that this really was Reset Center 1. That the surviving populations, whether they were processed or whatever actually happened after the conflict, were brought in through this area and then facilitated to repopulate other areas where they had found surviving infrastructure, surviving cities. The other interesting thing is just how elaborate the surviving infrastructure of this particular area is. Recall that the population went from 500,000 to 8 million in a very short amount of time. And there's always that incredible story we have of the immense population growth by percentage in the United States. 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And how were they able to construct all this impressive infrastructure, especially for water treatment? Water treatment facilities are something that we tend to overlook when we do our explorations, and you'll find no shortage of them across the 5 boroughs that show a very elaborate and old-world construction style behind them. And when I look at these many water treatment facilities across the area, I'm reminded of where we've seen them in other locations, such as the very impressive water towers of St. Louis that endure to this day. Ah yes, our finest masonry construction that was available in the 1800s. And you can see the detailing within this, these mixtures of blocks and bricks and unique coloring, and the fact that these structures all survive to this day. There's even the engineering achievement of the Croton Aqueduct. Ah yes, aqueducts. Something else that we got from the Romans. I always found it fascinating too that the Romans never actually went through any sort of industrial revolution, according to the official history, that they just had manual labor, and that's the answer for everything. Much like in the same way that we managed to pull off constructing all these impressive infrastructure establishments across not just New York, but the entire United States, was all done because we seemed to have infinite pools of labor. And it was easier because there were no safety standards. Now, of course, if you take the no safety standards to the opposite end of the spectrum, you realize that when you suddenly have a bunch of accidents in a particular work area and people are dying like flies, then no one's really going to want to work in that particular work area. It's going to have a reputation. The images that we have, though, paint an entirely different picture of this establishment of the infrastructure below the 5 boroughs. How exactly did they build this entire water system, or this water purification system, from scratch? We're informed officially that having resources is something that we still struggle with to this day, even with all of our modern technology, our excavation systems, and of course the advent of the computer. And at least I say anything about artificial intelligence, which is applicable in everything that we do now. But I look at these images and once again I have to question, is this an original construction or is this actually a salvage? In other words, they found all these facilities, albeit in a state of disrepair and damage from the previous reset event, and they had to be repaired. They had to be established and pressed back into service. And would that make a lot more sense with what we have with our current timeline? Of course, we don't really have any idea for what the timeline actually is, and I have no doubt that oftentimes it's one of the most deceived process, which is understanding our chronology. But you look at all the images, the actual photos, and the artwork of this impressive water treatment system that was required to care for this massive population. If you don't have water, then you can't have a city. It's relatively simple. I recall when I was still teaching medieval classes about how there were water carriers in the great cities of Europe. And I always found that very difficult to believe, even back then. Why would anybody lay out a city where you actually have to carry water miles just to provide people with water? It didn't really make a lot of sense. It's always very interesting to see these elaborate stones, these building blocks of these structures that are part of the water treatment system. Why would anybody go to the effort or the trouble of making this decorative at that point in time? You would expect these buildings to be as functional as possible, and yet certainly our modern buildings look a lot more functional than this does. I guess somebody was still so focused on artwork at the time that they decided to engage in this process that official history tells us is rustication, building a structure to automatically look old from the moment it was already constructed because it's more stylish. If you go around the entire 5 boroughs, you'll see signs of this water treatment system, this original aqueduct. And these stones are very, very impressive. Once again, I'm reminded of many other sites that we've seen across the land, such as the gigantic retaining wall that we've explored in Dubuque, Iowa. A retaining wall that no one really seems to know who originally constructed, and one that we certainly can't replicate today, or at least it would be prohibitively expensive. It's not because we can't do it, it's just because we lack the desire to do it, because, we have to minimize costs everywhere that we can. That is the end result of capitalism. But looking at these older water treatment plants and these centers for how this was carried out, we see signs of a much more advanced technology, a much greater capability. Certainly this is not a structure you would expect to see from the 1800s, designed to facilitate and treat water for the entire population of the city. And yet we have numerous images, numerous references to this very impressive system. And of course all we have for the design is just, once again, a single perspective design. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other examples of it, potentially hiding in someone's basement or maybe even in someone's toilet, much like Urbano Monte's world map that was found in a toilet, because, where else would you find such things? But how exactly do you reconcile this capability of even constructing a structure like this? Something that doesn't really look like any sort of water treatment facility, but something that others might reference as a temple or a tomb, especially when we're talking about older civilizations, because every single structure for older civilizations seems to be labeled a temple or a tomb. I mean, you could very much easily label this impressive water treatment structure in New York City a temple or a tomb. Now, I know you're saying, why aren't you referring to the official name of it? Well, sometimes I try to refrain from referring to official names. You look at the images that we have of the construction of this impressive water treatment system. And I also am reminded of the underground system for the subway that was constructed in New York City. What kind of effort did this take? Once again, the official history tells us that the city was already there, but they had to dig out in between the streets to establish the subway. And no doubt in this image you see that they had to dig out and lay these gigantic pipes, these incredible systems with tremendous diameter to where you could fit several individuals shoulder to shoulder for this photo. How difficult would that have really been? And why isn't anybody doing that to this day? For that matter, why aren't we building water treatment structures like this today? Well, of course the answer will be it's not practicable. There's no real reason to do it. Why do we need to decorate it? And why do we want to bother making rusticated stone so it already looks old once we've constructed it? We can just easily build a very effective water treatment facility and not make it a castle-like structure. It only makes sense. It's very well documented that people might have had some strange pursuits in the past, and they might have put a little too much emphasis on artistry. Therefore, there's no need for any sort of creative structural designs to this day. But when you recall looking at our explorations of Niagara Falls and the surrounding area, we see the same thing. Think about what this effort really took. All of this dirt had to be excavated and removed. And every single one of these blocks or bricks or whatever the original construction materials were had to be placed in a very precise manner. There's also the fact that every single one of these details that we see are surviving to this day. In other words, this impressive infrastructure was built to last. Certainly not something that we have attributed to our current civilization. Now, maybe you think the container revival style is going to last a long time, and you know what, I could probably make the argument that yes, it will. If you buy a container revival style house, it's going to last longer than your modern siding houses that you'll see in the numerous subdivisions. Yes, the subdivisions, the only thing that we seem to construct to these days, but that's because it's more economically viable. Think about this particular image, for example. What kind of effort actually went into digging this out? And how was it done in the distant past? Where did all these materials come from, and how are they brought in, overcoming the logistical challenges? Or is it more possible that all of this had already been established by a previous civilization, and it simply needed to be cleaned up and repurposed? I always found this diagram very intriguing of an aqueduct from the times of Rome. Yet somehow it looks a little bit more advanced and almost seems to be indicating an entirely different design. I know it's just a drawing and anybody could do a drawing, but something about it does seem to be a little bit more advanced and a little bit more impressive than we'd expect of what the Roman capabilities were at the time. And remember, the Romans never actually went through an industrial revolution of any sort, but they did somehow manage to contrive a concrete that is vastly superior to any of the concretes or cements that we officially have available to this day, or even in the recent past. The Reservoir of Manhattan, the waterworks. And here in this image from the very early 1800s, you can see that apparently we had the inclination to impose artistic stylings on our waterworks because, well, why wouldn't you build a great statue of Poseidon? Ah, yes, that infinite reference that we seem to have to deities, whether they be of Rome or Greece or any other pantheon of deities. And we always seem to want to integrate them within our structures. I mean, how would you know it's a water treatment plant if you didn't put some kind of godlike figure on top of it? And don't forget the columns, that's very important. Keep in mind this was during the nascent phase of the United States when expansion was happening. Oh, and they were also building the Erie Canal. But, it stands to reason if they could pull off the Erie Canal in a very short amount of time, which involved extensive work. And don't forget, the official history tells us that the workers of the Erie Canal faced great difficulties. And the official history also says that people didn't like different groups of people. Yes, and yet despite all these challenges, despite all these logistical limitations, they were able to pull all this off. I know the answer will be because there was more money available in the past, there were no safety standards, and every single person who came from Europe was a master artisan and craftsman. Nobody was a logistician though, but remember, we can just assume that the logistics happened. And clearly they did. I mean, the structures are there. Some of the other images though that we have showing Manhattan Island do give an indication of this impressive architecture. Once again, why would someone build a water treatment plant that looks like this? Why is it so advanced? Oh, and here in this particular image, you can see that it's right next to a structure that looks like it belongs in some sort of World's Fair or some other sort of exposition. Because once again, no one's going to build a building like that. Someone told me in one of the comments that the reason that we went away from these dome structures or tore them down is because they're expensive to maintain. But once again, I always find it quite intriguing that we want to say that cost is a reason for why we don't do things anymore. And yet we have a system in place that allows us to continuously raise our debt ceiling every single year. So how can you say there's any sort of limitation to cost? Another one of these interesting artistic renderings that shows us the water treatment facility. And yet in the background, there seems to be no shortage of smokestacks. Is this some sort of representation, or was this actually a first-hand observer's artistic impression of what they really saw as the entire area of Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs was being repopulated, as it was being repaired and pressed back into service? Because you really have to step back and ask, what makes more sense? Because when you really look at the images of what remains to this day, you see structures that no one would build today. No one would build in the 1950s. Maybe someone would try it in the 1920s or the 1930s. I mean, yes, the 1920s, we say it was the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of economic prosperity, but the 1930s certainly weren't. But there's an explanation for that too, because the government had to put people to work, and therefore it had numerous programs to put people to work. But that's really the last time, at least in the United States, that you'll see any sort of reference to structures like this with what we're informed as masonry construction being built at a large level and across the entire land in many simultaneous projects at the same time. How much effort did this really take if this was done the way that we were told historically, where the city was already established? All the blocks were already planned out. There were people already living amongst this area when they had to dig out and establish this water treatment system, or to say nothing of the subway. And no, it's not just on the East Coast. You may recall our recent exploration when we looked at Omaha, and we saw that they inform us that they actually dug out the streets of Omaha. Well, people were living there, so they could level the grounds, so they could establish a sewage system, because apparently they didn't have one before. Very, very intriguing with all these conflicting accounts that we have. And now let's take a look at some images of New York from the 20th century, the 1900s. Ah, yes, our hanging policeman. I don't really understand this from the early 1900s? Is this just really to get into our face that there really were no safety standards and nobody had anything better to do than to just hang around? There is actually an explanation for this hanging policeman, and we'll get to it here in a moment, but why, if your conduct was law enforcement, would you be focused on doing something like this? Or was, it just kind of the concept of parlor tricks for the early 20th century and to get attention? Also, something else to think about. Here is a colorized version of that photograph. And I want you to really think about this. If a photo has color added later, or if it's altered in some way, is it still an original photograph? Is it still the original depiction of what actually happened? And don't forget that a photograph is just a photograph. You are seeing a representation of the event. You are not seeing the real event with your own eyes happen. It amazes me how often we tend to forget that because, well, we see so many photographs and we see so much video that we just accept everything we see at face value. And maybe that is the situation. Now, what's the story behind this police officer? Performs on the edge of space. It takes something strikingly unusual to startle the hundreds of thousands of people who rush along Broadway. Charles N. Fitzgerald, in command of the air police of that city, recently made multitudes gasp in amazement. And he would perform this way, doing these thrilling stunts by hanging off of girders and doing all sorts of parlor tricks and flips. Maybe he did cartwheels on the top of these girders, who knows? But did this really happen? I mean, certainly if a modern-day New York police officer attempted to do this, there would be all sorts of disciplinary issues. But back in the day, oh no, it was encouraged. The media even supported it. Flip around all you want to on your girders and show your physical capability. Now the article says that he did it to stay in shape for his job. Dedication back during that time. Looking at some of the images, though, especially from the early 20th century of New York, we can see that there are a multitude of old world buildings that had many of these stylings and these architectural detailings within them that we've come to associate with the old world. There's no shortage of large blocks of domes and cupolas. Now, once again, people say, well, the issue was we had to tear them down because we couldn't maintain them. So if it was prohibitively expensive to maintain all these domes and these cupolas, how was it not prohibitively expensive to construct them in the first place? Was the economy really just that much better in the 1800s? And many of the construction images that we have are quite intriguing. And I'm oftentimes reminded of the most notorious example that we have of the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania, where you see construction, and yet the layout of the interior doesn't match with the current present interior of the Cathedral of Learning. And I'm not even going to say anything about these counterbalance cranes, and maybe someone really needs to get around to actually patenting that human hamster wheel crane that we've always wanted to build. Now, we don't really have many working examples of it, but it is very well documented in artist pictures and renderings. We've explored many of the towers of New York, and we've seen that there is a variety of architectural stylings. Now, you would expect this to be very difficult, especially with the compression and the constraints that you have of a large existing city with a very large population. Remember, one that was already over 500,000 by the mid-1800s. But that didn't stop people from building these incredible structures with all these wonderful artistic touches on them. What exactly are these symbols and what do they really represent? Well, I guess it was just the United States and New York City in the 1800s, and I don't need to ask any more questions. An image such as this, where you see this interesting variety in these structures. You see columns that are integrated into the walls. You see design decorations on the rooftops. You also see the very unique way that the structures seem to fit together. Now, a different perspective might indicate that this could have been a dystopian nightmare. And one of the things I've always said about the Old World, or Tartaria, the previous civilization, is that it certainly wasn't always any sort of balanced civilization. There is no doubt in my mind that it went through its dark days or its challenging time frames, just as everything seems to. And perhaps what we see with some of these structures that are very compressed and cramped together, that this is exactly what happened. So why was it that New York City became Reset Center 1? Simple. Because it seems to have had the most surviving infrastructure. It had systems that were already in place that with a minimal amount of effort at the time were able to be salvaged and brought back into service. And because of that, because of the existing natural harbor, whether we want to say it was natural or not, or have different theories on that, It facilitated the rapid redistribution of population to support the post-reset efforts of imposing the process of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. We look at the many images that we have that show a city that seems to give a completely different character than what we'd expect. And there's no shortage of images that show the presence of airships. There's also the fact that many of the structures, most famously the Empire State Building, seem to have been designed to facilitate a docking area for the airships. And don't forget the armories that we looked at earlier. That also seemed to have some sort of area that was designed for airship docking. And imagine if you had a transit system that wasn't just reliant on ground transportation, but was more reliant on air transportation. Then suddenly this vertical society of building these structures, these skyscrapers, makes a lot more sense. Because if you think about the limitations of the 1800s, why not just simply expand? Expand the boroughs. Keep expanding the city and utilizing the land that surrounds it. Continue to expand it on a two-dimensional plane. But that's not what we see that's happened in New York City. We see these skyscrapers that have been built to the very clouds. And we see many images of airships that seem to interface and dock with these skyscrapers. Is this just all an elaborate coincidence? There's also the presence of the fact that you do have this city that seems to have been built from the ground up to consider all these various transit systems. The fact that perhaps this being the surviving city of the previous civilization, it did have these transit systems that simply needed to be salvaged and pressed back into service. Now, it should be noted that there are accounts, especially in the 1890s, of the horse and buggies overwhelming Manhattan especially, that they had to be banned. Because what happens when you have tens of thousands of horses in a very cramped urban area? Well, the horses have to defecate, and before too long you have a lot of horse poop. As someone who's worked with horses, I can attest to that. One of the things you're doing is you're mucking stalls or mucking the areas where horses have operated, and that's simply scooping up the poop to make it viable to continue operations. Isn't this an interesting image? There's all the different futuristic inclinations that we've had that are associated with New York. And, as I said, the fact that it appears in many different prominent factors. When we consider our exploration earlier of Soylent Green, it of course was set in New York. And where does this terminology Empire City and the Empire State come from? Were they originally intending New York to be some sort of new empire? Or is it some sort of reference that merely survived in the vernacular at the time? Hard to say. Yes, I know we have our official historical account because somehow we always seem to know the exact origin of every sobriquet that we use, whether it's for a city or a person. And here you can see it in this image, all these horses and buggies that were operational at that time. Of course, now if you're going to use a horse and buggy in New York, it's considered a novelty, or it's something that you can see and enjoy in The Muppets Take Manhattan. But looking at some of the older images, you again have the impression of more advanced architecture. You see elements of someone who had the capability to lay out structures in different formats, with what we're informed are different architectural stylings. Once again, I'm amazed at all the different architectural movements that we had from the 1800s to the early 1900s, and that just seemed to all go away. And who knows, maybe there actually is a mainstream explanation that makes total sense. It's the same reason for why we don't do original intellectual properties in our entertainment today. It's just easier to do what's already been done before, and really that's all anybody wants to see. So, we've got to give people what they want. Why try anything new or establish any sort of originality? Some of these victory arches are always very intriguing, and when you look at some of the varied images, it's amazing to think that New York appears in many different identifications. In some images, it appears as though it's some kind of futuristic science fiction city. In others, it seems to be some sort of amalgamation, a combination of an older city and yet with many newer structures. Even to this day, if you walk the skyscrapers or you get down on ground zero and walk around and look at all the old world structures, you might play a little game with yourself to try to identify when the structure was originally constructed. And then, of course, actually trying to determine when all the renovations were done on each of these structures. The harbor, though, seems to be the main answer. And let's also not forget that there's a lot of points of interest that are in very close geographical proximity to the Great Harbor of New York. For example, Coney Island, which we explored and has its own reputation of being the display of the incubator babies. Again, another coincidence. The fact that the orphan trains were facilitated through New York City. And, of course, the official history says that's because of the society at that time. There were a lot of people who were having children out of wedlock, and that's why there were so many orphans at that time. At least that's what we understand it to be. But looking at structures such as this, with the cupola and the domes, and even on smaller structures, you have to really consider the effort that had to go into this construction. And how exactly would one really go about deconflicting all this with the other structures? We have numerous accounts of buildings that only lasted for a few years, and yet they were very elaborate structures, certainly not buildings that we build to this day, such as the Gelander building that didn't really last that long and was quickly torn down and replaced by many other buildings. Now, these are just the named buildings that we're aware of. How many structures do we really have in New York that we don't actually keep tabs on or don't really have a historical account to them? Yes, I know there are people out there that'll tell you there's everything in public records, nothing's ever lost in public records, even though there's incessant examples of many things being lost or missing from public records. But sure, we can put our faith in public records. I'm just asking, how many structures do we really have that we don't have the official history behind? Now, yes, I know there'll be explanations behind it. The records were lost in a fire, somebody flushed them down the toilet, they were ripped up during a mouse chase, and we just don't have them anymore. But I think the most interesting thing about this city is looking at the ways in which it's changed, but also comparing that with the ways that it's stayed the same. Because how many flat iron structures are there across the land? What other cities have we seen this particular structure style that we thought was only unique to New York City? But where else has it appeared? I'll give you a hint, there's a very prominent southern city where this exact same structure appears. But maybe that was just the structure that we wanted to go with at that time. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a surviving example of a civilization that made maximum use and had the capability to do so of the land that they were constructing the buildings on. Why do we have so many images that show the trolley in a completely different infrastructure and transit capability? Because it's not just about moving people, it's also about moving materials. And if you really think about it, you have to have a much more extensive transit capability, one that involves land, sea, and air, if you're really going to pull off something like this compressed urban area. There's also the mentality that comes around with it. For example, looking at this particular structure, and once again we have a little dome with a cupola on top of it. Why would anybody ever bother with that in the official history? Why would anybody go to that effort to do that? And I'm also amazed by some of the images that we see that show more advanced trains and trolleys than we'd expect to see. I know it was well documented at that time that we were trying many different designs, and during that time frame we had a focus on creative artistic impressions. And look, just because we live in a current civilization that doesn't value that just wants to do derivative redos, reimaginings, and retakes of everything, there's no reason to question things that in the past there was a different civilization that really had the ability to create and innovate. You know, we love to say those words, we love to say that we innovate, but how much do we really innovate? For example, these images that we have of this great apocalypse of horse feces that was all over Manhattan Island. Strangely enough, this was only a problem in the 1890s, and also odd that you don't hear this being a problem in other cities. Now the explanation will be because everybody was looking to have their high society in New York, and keep in mind this is also the most valuable land, especially when you're talking about the areas of downtown Manhattan, Fifth Avenue, and so on and so forth. You have very wealthy people who were using their horse and buggies, and it created an apocalyptic mess of horse manure that had to be cleared very quickly. And yet it's rather odd that this wasn't a problem in other cities, at least it's not referred to, or other towns, because exclusively at that time, we were reliant on horse and buggy for immediate transportation. It's not like you could jump on the train and it would take you all the way back to your house, or take you from the opera houses or Broadway that everybody was going to at that time, and going back to your residence or your flat, which, by the way, was also in another built-up structure. How exactly did they clear up this problem? And I think of the many TED Talks that we have that talked about this environmental disaster, and yet it only seemed to occur in one particular area. So what to make of it? It's very difficult. Ah, yes, the World Building in New York. One of my favorite old world structures. A skyscraper that actually had a dome, almost looking like it's from a state capitol, built on top of it. It even has a pediment. And once again, I'm asking the question, why don't we build like this anymore? Why don't we go to the effort to build skyscrapers that have this kind of artistic impression in them? Do we just lack the capability? Why wouldn't we want to do this? It's too expensive to maintain the dome, but it's certainly not too expensive to continue to support regional wars anywhere and everywhere that they happen. And it's most certainly not too expensive to continuously raise the debt ceiling every single year. So I'm really not buying the argument that we just don't have the financial capability to do this. And remember, New York City is the home of the most billionaires and millionaires in the land. So really, how do we not have the money to do these things? Well, you know what they say. Money can allow you to do anything just so long as you're supposed to do it. Now, looking at some of these other images, you can see again the impressive buildings in the background and the variations of construction. And it really gives us the overall hint that we're actually looking at different eras from a past civilization. That's what I believe that we see when we look at the genuine old world structures of New York, and that's what makes it so incredibly interesting. Now we can accept the fact that our mainstream history tells us that we managed to pull off all these incredible feats, and that during the 1800s we could really achieve anything. We could build a nation where there had been no nation. We could build cities and courthouses and state capitals all in a short amount of time. We could build an entire infrastructure where none had existed. And again, I ask you the question, how many towns and cities did we build from the ground up after 1940? Does it compare with the number of towns and cities that we built from the ground up in the 1800s? Just looking at the United States. Yes, I know the European example is a little bit more difficult because there is a longer written history. But is that to say that there's truly a different background for what really happened? Looking at some of these impressive structures, though, you get the idea of grand palaces and grand forums, something that, if we were looking at an ancient civilization, we'd be told these are all tombs and temples. This is not a transit station. This is a municipal building. Ah, yes, and one of my favorite Art Deco buildings in the background there. And in our explorations of New York City, we've seen that there are some of the most interesting and unique, varied architectural examples. And there's always that competition that was going on between Chicago and New York at that time. Ah, yes, the lovely Federal Hall and the lovely New York Stock Exchange and all the other intricate buildings that, once again, don't seem to reflect a very what we'd think of as American nature with a lot of these structures. For some reason, I'm almost thinking that we're looking at some remnant of Rome here. Why is it we always have these pediments and these columns? Well, because everybody wants to be like Rome. Rome was just incredibly cool in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. And that's why you had structures like this. How exactly was this originally constructed and laid out? What techniques were used to really achieve all of this? Oh, look. Yes, it's the location where Solidus Snake finally died after he fell off the top. But every single time I look at these different structures, especially the unique rooftops and the different walls and supporting beams, and every single decoration that somebody went to the effort of putting on them, you have to really ask the question, how much time and effort would it have really taken? Is it really possible that every single artistic detailing, even on this one structure, which is just one smaller building in a greater metropolitan area, was done and pulled off in the 1800s? Well, yes, because everybody was an artisan and craftsman. Of course, that's why that's the only explanation for why we have these impressive structures. How else are you going to explain it? How else are you going to say that, yes, it was because there were people who were just such hard workers and there were no safety standards? That's exactly how this was done. And it's intriguing that that's the explanation for everything. It's also the explanation for how Rome was able to achieve its architectural incredible monstrosities, or however you want to phrase them, because they had infinite labor and they had no safety standards. And if you just have labor, you can take care of everything. Well, of course, And apparently when you have forced labor, you don't have to feed it. You don't have to provide it water. You don't have to care for it, do you? The other thing that we often overlook are the incredible port facilities. The port facilities that, once again, seem to be very well constructed and have something a little bit more complicated than what we'd expect to see at that time. You would expect to see perhaps some very large and extensive two-dimensional wooden structures. But once again, that's not the case. Once again, we have very elaborate facilities that seem to be some sort of either advanced masonry construction, as they say at the time, or perhaps it involved some sort of advanced cement. Was it Rossendale? Was it Portland? Or was it Roman concrete? Or was it something else entirely? I'm always amazed by the fact of how much we take things at face value. And looking at even the nature of the very streets itself, the cobblestone streets or the brick streets, that's the ones that were covered in horse feces that had to be cleared, or were the victim of many blizzards during the odd weather events that seemed to occur in the 1800s. So really we've had everything here that's transpired in these 5 boroughs in Manhattan Island. So overall, what are your thoughts on New York City being reset Center 1? Is it possible that this in fact was the surviving infrastructure along with the supporting system, and that's why we have all of these impressive structures? Why this was purposed with the current civilization to be the main nexus point? And you can even make the argument that this particular area continues to survive as the main nexus point for this current civilization. The United Nations is headquartered in this area. We have so many different civilizations and societies that overlap in this particular area. And whether that's going with the alternative theory of there being other civilizations in the more immediate past that we're not aware of, or just simply the existence of different societies that we can see by the different spoken languages. Over 800 official languages that are spoken within the city. And if you travel it today, you'll certainly see that's the case. There are many different cultures that are represented here. And was that always by design? Was this always supposed to be the area that we have our main facilitation point, our seaport of debarkation, our main point for resetting an entire civilization, for facilitating the process of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination? All the immigrants to the United States came through New York City. All of the orphans originated in New York City, or they were brought there. There's also so many different examples of the impressive architecture of the past. Columns, pillars, pediments, and obelisks even, along with the great triumph arches that we have. Everything seen in one particular geographical area. Is that because it really was a city that did happen to develop in the way that we understand with the official historical account? Or is it because of the fact that it's actually one of the most intact surviving examples of an entire old world urban area? One that continues to endure to this day. And whether you're looking at the older images of New York or you're actually just walking through the streets present day, I suggest that you take a look and pay attention to all the different symbols, all the different representations that you see, and really try to understand, try to deconflict your understanding, especially your official historical understanding, of the development of this impressive city over time, and even the very identity of the United States itself. Do the symbols that you see, do the representation that you see in each of these structures actually reflect what your understanding is? And also understand the fact that here in the 21st century, we've seen the development and the establishment of these great pencil skyscrapers, something that from a distance tends to draw your attention. And if you think about that, is that another means of obscuring or hiding what remains of the old world in plain sight? Because our eyes will always be drawn to the shiny skyscrapers. And even though when we actually pay attention to the detail, they don't possess the detail that are in the old world structures. They don't have all the incredible artistic renderings that we have. The faces, the designs, the leaf motifs, and all the other symbols that we don't seem to know exactly what they stand for, that are present in every single structure that are across the land, and every single legitimate old world structure that still exists in the great city to this day. Why don't we build flat iron buildings anymore? Well, we just don't have the desire to do it. But as always, I leave it to you. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? Did this city develop just as we're told it did historically? Or does this theory of this area being reset center 1 actually hold weight? And if you live in the city, I suggest you walk around and pay attention to where you still see the examples of surviving old world architecture. You might be surprised to know that it is a lot more prominent and a lot more present than you like to believe, once you look past the beautiful, shiny skyscrapers and the newer ones that we've been establishing. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Coney Island, a land of many different mysteries that go all the way back to, you'll never guess it, the 1800s. And we can see now that it's beset by modern functional architecture. But if you get on a subway in New York and you're on your way to Coney Island, you may come across some of these mysteries. For example, the geographical position of Coney Island, which just happens to be located right in the narrows between Upper and Lower New York Bay. Whatever name we're referring to the bay by, though, it's very intriguing to think that Coney Island happens to be at the main point of entry. And we understand that New York City was the first true megalopolis in the United States. And here you can see the exact position of Coney Island right before the narrows between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So you can see it would be the main point of access. But there's many mysteries, such as these incredible amusement parks and very unique architecture. Was it temporary architecture? Or was there something more applicable about this Dragon Gorge area? And who is this real estate developer who tried to save Steeplechase Park? And is this actually a Stargate, a power generator, or something else? And we also had an incubator baby exhibit at Coney Island, one of the most famous ones. So all these different mysteries in this land of where a reset seems to have occurred, which could have been one of the significant starting points, as we have New York City as the first main population center in the United States. Join me as we explore these mysteries of Coney Island, the old world playground. Port of entry, post-reset 18-year unknown. Why would we say that Coney Island is a port of entry? And what would that really mean? Looking at Coney Island today, we can see that it's been through many of the modernizations or urban renewal efforts of the 1960s. And indeed, that rather familiar-looking real estate developer we saw in the intro, we'll look into his account of how he tried to renew and reinvigorate this particular area in the 1960s. But what's really the official historical account that we have with Coney Island, and why is it significant? Well, we understand that its positioning is right in the area between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. And of course, I jest about the various names that we have for all of our bodies of water because they always seem to be changing, much like we change other names. I'm not going to say anything about military bases in the United States. But we can see here that Coney Island is a part of Brooklyn, and that it divides Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So all of the main shipping coming from the Atlantic had to go by or pass by Coney Island, positioned right here. Now really think on this. Was this actually an original port of entry? We understand that Ellis Island and the area leading into New York City was really the port of entry into the United States. Or was there some other story that we have? A different account of Coney Island? Now, there are different maps that show us that it was originally a series of islands, as it runs all the way out to Long Island. There's also different stories or historical records that indicate that the very first cities, indeed Gravesend just north of Coney Island, or the next neighborhood over in Brooklyn, which is what Coney Island and Gravesend are part of, were the original settlements of the Dutch in what is today New York Harbor. But that's the official historical account. Ah yes, Gravesend. Very intriguing, isn't it, that we have a little steeple church that marked an entire town. Of course, those are the kinds of anomalies that you have when you look at the original maps. And is there something significant about Gravesend? Is there something significant about this overall existence of the way that these settlements come together? And indeed, the way that Coney Island and Long Island was stated to be different islands. Now, development, changes in the environment, did it actually cause all of these different pieces of land to become amalgamated, or was there something else that occurred? Looking at the bird's eye view of Coney Island, which we have, and for those of you who aren't familiar, Coney Island became an amusement park. And the stated reason for this was because it was accessible to many people looking to get away from the vast tenements in New York City or Manhattan Island in the 1880s and onward. And it led to the development of these amusement parks. Although the three great amusement parks that made up Coney Island were all constructed from 1890 to 1910. Yes, a very puzzling 20-year time period. And looking at the bird's eye view, we can see here, zooming in on Steeplechase Park, which was one of the main parks, we see the very puzzling architecture and also some of the fun rides. Now, were these really roller coasters, or could they have represented something else? Perhaps a larger apparatus, thinking outside the box a little bit. Looking at Luna Park, we see that it has a large tower in the middle of it, the second of the great parks. And interestingly enough, as we look at these parks, we see that they seem to become even greater in grandeur. As we go to Dreamland, what a very fitting name for an amusement park that has a large 300-foot tower in the middle of it. Well, I guess back during those times, you needed a large 300-foot tower to complete your amusement park experience. Now, officially, the racetrack being present, and this was horse racing, make no mistakes about it, as this was 1890 to 1910, was very critical for bringing people into the area. And then when they banned horse racing, well, that's what caused horse racing to move to Kentucky, so the official story goes. We also have another well-developed neighborhood here in Coney Island. And looking at the array of images and postcards that we have, we see the entire concept of amusement being played out. Now, let's think about this. Amusement, an active pursuit. What the defenders of the mainstream narrative oftentimes tell us, or mainstream account, or the actual history, however you want to refer to it as, is that people worked very, very hard in the 1800s and even the early 1900s. They worked long days, and the official history tells us that amusement was not an active pursuit. They really tell us that prior to the establishment of amusement parks and so on and so forth in the early 1900s, people conducted amusement as sort of a reactionary thing, or just very much they didn't have it planned in their day. Whereas now that you've built these incredible amusement parks, suddenly amusement and seeking recreation became an active pursuit. Now, is that really the way it always was, or is that just simply what we're being informed? Because when you look closely at some of this imagery, whether it's the actual photographs, and of course we always have the issue with the photographs, are they fully accurate or aren't they? They're clues, or the postcards. We do get many indications that these incredible amusement parks, the three that we went over, were very elaborate. And indeed, we asked that question, why exactly was a giant, well-lit tower, which we'll look closely at here in a second, necessary to convey the amusement in Coney Island, or these parks? And oddly enough, these parks, when you look at the official account, here we have the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Luna Park, because Jules Verne was the well-known quote-unquote science fiction author of the time. And so why wouldn't you have a vast amusement park? And keep in mind, this is in the very early 1900s, before we had these numerous film adaptations, including the famous one with Kirk Douglas with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But of course we have a wonderful display and a ride that you could really go on. I mean, whatever you want to call it. And of course it's filled with very elaborate and impressive architecture. To include our favorite cartouche symbol. Yes, we had to ensure that we built our favorite cartouche symbol all over these structures. And if you pay attention, you'll see that there are numerous details that show us unique symbols that are arrayed all over these particular parks. Now look at this particular tower. This isn't exactly the kind of design that you'd see. Now, I understand that people will say or think that perhaps these structures were made out of very cheap or temporary material, as amusement parks tend to be. And there are some indications of that when we look at the images. But there are other indications that show us that these were constructed out of more permanent materials, or something that was designed to last. Now, you may be asking, what exactly happened to Coney Island? And I'm sure you'll never guess it because, it's a story or a historical record that we've never come across before. Destruction by either natural disaster or fire. I'm sure you can guess where the story is already going. But before we get to that, really look at some of these structures and appreciate the detailing that went into them. And let's be considerate here. Let's just suppose that these structures really are all made out of temporary material, whether we want to call it stucco, plaster, or staff, the variations that we have. I'm always interested in the fact that we have wonderfully designated temporary materials. It's interesting to me that even with temporary materials, we were able to construct and put this kind of effort into this sort of detailing, as though we had to make the park incredibly beautiful. And yet our amusement parks to this day certainly don't match this in any way, shape, or form. Now, is that to say that necessarily proves anything? No. We can certainly go with the understood historical comprehension of what the society was like at this time, that yes, people did work harder, and yes, they did put more artistic effort into their constructions. But keep in mind, where exactly does that inspiration come from if these people really are working all the time? And indeed, that's the understanding that we have, is that recreation, amusement, was not an active pursuit in the 1800s. It was something that developed later. But the issue is, if the mind is never allowed to be idle, then you're never allowed to inspire. And are we really looking at an apparatus of lost technology? Is that really what these amusement parks are? The location and the position of Coney Island is no coincidence. And keep in mind that New York, considered to be the greatest natural harbor in the world, you could understand why this could be a large port of entry. Were these structures built out of temporary appearing materials? Or were these structures already there? Or is there some other explanation? And you can see that there was a grand procession of many great activities and displays, spectacles that accompanied these incredible structures. And you can see why Coney Island was referred to as the amusement park of the world, or as we're referring to it in this particular exploration, the playground of the old world. And that was the actual sobriquet of it, playground of the world. Ah, yes, this incredible globe tower. Apparently an architect in the very early 1900s had this concept to build this very impressive and unique edifice, a vertical display of an amusement park, if you will. But not just a display, a practical application. A globe tower that was actually an amusement park in and of itself. Now again, the official history tells us that this impressive structure was never completed. But if this was beyond the means at the time, then why would anybody come up with this particular design? And looking more closely, you can just see how elaborate and exquisite this impressive edifice was, even in concept. This is something from a science fiction movie. And indeed, the gargantuan size of it seems to defy the implements that were available at the time. Now, did this only exist in concept? Or is it possible that this was also another remaining structure that was at Coney Island that was torn down over time? Well, of course, people say that's merely the realm of speculation and a wild imagination. Maybe so. But there are many other structures and details when you look closely at the images that we have of the three amusement parks in their heyday at Coney Island, which, by the way, was only from the late 1890s to 1911. And after that, unfortunately, we already began to lose many of these great structures in Coney Island, with a series of fires that beset the parks. Ah, yes, this definitely encourages the saying that the devil's in the details. And again, looking closely at some of the architecture, we have hints that there are more prevailing, more enduring construction materials that were utilized in the construction of these impressive edifices. Now, this particular impressive tower in Dreamland, which is over 300 feet. Now, this tower no longer stands, so we don't have a way to verify it. We can't assess and analyze the construction materials, unfortunately. But I'm reminded of the great, wonderful areas that we've seen across the United States that still endure to this day that are somewhat mystifying, such as the plaza in Kansas City. And look at all the effort that went into the construction of this creation display, or this creation attraction, whatever you want to call it. I have to say, There are certain details in this that seem to go way beyond what we see in modern-day Disneyland or Disney World. Perhaps we'll have to do an exploration of Lucius Aurelian's adventure to Disneyland. It's a great story. But looking closely here, we see the architectural detail of columns amalgamated into the walls again. And even looking at the older imagery of the amusement parks on Coney Island, we see some rather bizarre curiosities. Apparently this large elephant was a hotel. Now again, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just looking at an image and reading accounts, as are the rest of you. Now, we can accept these official historical accounts or these records, or we can question them. Because remember, historians are not the ones who are charged with actually keeping records in the moment. Who actually does that? Well, oftentimes we rely on the media. The issue with that, though, is that from official sources, the media or journalists are not qualified to ascertain the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Only certified historians and scientists can do that. So the people who actually keep the records are not the people who are certified to determine the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Does anybody ever really question that? No, probably not. But looking at some of these other images here of Luna Park and looking in the background, we do see some very interesting architecture. And the detailing that went into this, the effort that went into really creating this fairy tale land. Perhaps we can accept the fact that there was a time when people who had never actively pursued amusement just decided on a whim to invest all this time, all this effort, and all these resources into doing something that had never been done before, for a people whose lifestyle had never been suited to actively seeking amusement. I mean, really think about this. What actually compelled people to go to Coney Island, Long Island? Well, we'll be informed that because New York City was getting oppressed with all the close construction and the various tenements in the 1800s, people were seeking escape from the hot summer. So they decided to go down here to the beach, watch the elephants go on by, and appreciate this very incredible, elaborate architecture. Remember, these were people who were informed worked all the time, and their sole purpose in life was to work, and that recreation or amusement was merely a byproduct of the day. And if you remember watching some of those old historical films about the 1800s, about the couple on the farm, you might recall that the highlight of their amusement was the husband falling off the ladder and landing on his butt, and his wife laughing at him. And that was the highlight of their amusement. So we're supposed to reconcile that. Now, yes, I understand that is a historical record or a perception that people were inflicting on us from people from the 1800s, who of course we don't know and we've never talked to. Why would you go to all this effort to build and put all these resources into establishing these incredible amusement parks? Now, we understand that it was just a simple series of rides, one of the original gravity roller coasters in the 1880s, and then as time went on, they just decided to build these very impressive and incredible amusement parks, earning the sobriquet of Coney Island being the playground of the world. But is that really what it was? Or had it been the fact that there really was the remnants of all this incredible architecture, either from another civilization, an overlapping timeline, or some other explanation? I'm always willing to accept the fact that the historical account could be correct, but when you try to reconcile it and make it work, there always tends to be so many issues. Every answer creates 3 or 4 more questions, and you're always trying to understand that during this time, the late 1800s, was when the United States was still expanding westward. The resources that were still going into expanding westward. You also have to take into account the fact that there were numerous economic issues, the Great Depression before the Great Depression in the 1870s, and all the panics that ultimately warranted a complete overhaul of the U.S. economic system, the establishment of a central bank, and the imposition of federal income tax. Here is a sketch of that original gravity coaster, and that's all we have of it. You also have this interesting display or series of attractions that promote disasters, such as this Johnstown flood. Now, I don't know if that's really what this is about, and this is a very interesting structure in and of itself as well. It's a pity it's not still standing, and it could well just be some sort of temporary material. But I have to ask the question that with these turrets and these large towers of this castle appearance, is it possible that there may have been a very different explanation? There's also the interesting concept of exhibition that's displayed here in Coney Island. And indeed, the one of the three amusement parks that lasted the longest to the 1960s, Steeplechase, and that was because of revival efforts, they actually had large forums like this that seemed to do displays much as we've seen in the World's Fairs. So again, we have to ask those hard questions. Is Coney Island originally just a series of amusement parks? Or did it have a series of different functions, much in the same way that the World's Fairs or exhibitions did? Not only was this a port of entry, if you will, for the people coming in to settle these lands that have just recently been surveyed after the last reset, it's also a place where the new society is going to be learned and understood by these people. Because remember, the hot dog that was developed in Coney Island and sold at Coney Island. And what exactly is going on in all these displays? What are they really representing? Because oftentimes we see different symbols and we see different displays that we don't have a common understanding was in the minds of the average American or whoever, because we also understand that there were many immigrants that were coming into the United States during this time frame, that these symbols would mean anything to them. Now, once again, defenders of the mainstream account will say that it's simply because everybody had this imagination and they brought in their myths and their legends from their homelands. Fair enough. But if that's really what happened, why is it we have all this reference to a time frame from the distant past? These pantheon of deities that we see were certainly not, as we understand it, in the mainstream religious collective in the 1800s. I mean, we didn't have some sort of movement to go back to the pagan deities of the Roman or Greek times, did we? And yet, for whatever reason, we see a lot of veneration and a lot of effort designed to construct the symbols. And why would anybody want to construct a tower like this in the middle of an amusement park? You would think that the resources, if you really were devoted to an amusement park, which, remember again, we're constructing for people who we understood did not pursue amusement actively. They only did it reactively. You're going to build a giant tower instead of roller coasters or other rides or other more cost-effective means to entertain people. I mean, I thought this was the United States, and we've always been about the pursuit of capitalism, building businesses, and making money. Now, whether we acquire that through people visiting our attractions or deriving the money from the land, the pursuit has always been to make money. But much like the World's Fairs, we understand that there seemed to be a lot of money that was invested in a concept that had not been proven. And so it seems to be the contradiction there if we take money and finances at face value. Because people who typically have a lot of money are good at generating money, are good at saving it, and are good at creating more money. At least that's what we understand it. But we're supposed to accept that these people who were good at those things just suddenly decided in a bout of altruism, or all the other terms that we have for it, philanthropy, one of my favorites, that they were just going to share this with the people at the time. And indeed, that's what the official account says. Because these robber barons, these people who had made their fortunes, they wanted to be remembered fondly. And what better way to be remembered fondly than just by giving your money away? Investing your money, or really not investing it, let's be honest, you're not going to get a return on this because there was no return of positive net benefit from investing in the World's Fairs or Coney Island. Even though there were a lot of efforts to revive Coney Island. And no, those efforts didn't end after the series of fires that befell several of the parks. And there's even an account that these fires did strike. And we'll look at that very closely. But why would anybody put all of this effort and all of their resources, whether they were rich or not, because we also have to look at the fact that there were people who were hired to work here. There were people who lived in the area to make these amusement parks and to draw all these people there. And then it also comes to that old question, what came first? Did the people come first because they were seeking the beaches, or were the attractions already there and that drew the people out there? All interesting questions. Now, oddly enough, with the reactivation, or perhaps we should say with the development of transportation technology, that's the explanation that we have for people being able to commute from Manhattan Island down here to Brooklyn. And indeed, the area is connected, so perhaps that is an explanation. But looking at some of these awe-inspiring sites with the employment of electricity, and keep in mind, once again, this is in the very early 1900s. Once again, I'm amazed that we have another example of how we just seem to be able to adopt and adapt this brand new technology very efficiently and very quickly. Now, oddly enough, we look at all the long issues that we have with establishing technology now. You would think that we would be more proficient at it, but it seems as though we were more proficient at true revolutionary technology in the early 1900s than we are now. Well, perhaps the advent of more artificial intelligence will help with that. Looking at some of these postcards, though, you can see images that truly seem to convey some sort of fairy tale world, or dare I say, some sort of science fiction world. And perhaps that's the most striking drama that you have when you look at the images of Coney Island, and yet you pay attention to some of the details in the background. And so here's what we have. We have this location that leads into the entryway into New York City, in between the two major bays, which is considered one of the finest natural harbors in the world. We have numerous accounts of all these people coming through this area. Now, these aren't immigrants, these aren't people coming into New York City according to the official account, but these are people that are living in New York City that are looking for a good time and looking to get away from the island. The island being Manhattan. And of course, we have all the rides that are associated with Coney Island. And that's the other question that we have to ask. Were these rides really just that, simple rides of amusement? Or is it possible that these rides themselves were also a remnant of this previous technology, or this large apparatus that for some reason had survived the last reset, if we're going with that theory, on explaining these incredible structures that are at Coney Island? Because what we really have here is an amalgamation of impressive structures and impressive machines, all in a very confined geographical area. And oddly enough, we went to a lot of effort to very well document this to this day. Now think about your own experiences going to amusement parks and what you really go there to do and what it's really about. It's about having fun, trying not to wait in line, and maybe getting some food that's not too much overpriced. But you look at some of these other images that we have of the amusement parks at Coney Island, and you also reconcile that with the postcards that we have, and it gives you the clue that there really was something very elaborate and incredible. And I have to pose that hard question, did the Globe Tower really exist? And is it possible that there were even more amazing structures that remain? This particular image right here shows us the initial train station to enter this area, and yet looking at the walkway, it gives us the impression here that it's been there for a much longer period of time and that it wasn't just recently established just 10, 15, 20 years before this image was taken. Of course, this is another one of those images that, according to the archive, has about a 15-year circa range to it. So who really knows? That's always the issue when you're trying to do any sort of image analysis. But there are no shortage of images, and really consider the society of the people that are going to this amusement park. We always have these individuals that are very well dressed. Now we could just say that was the societal mores of the time. In the 1900s in the United States, especially around New York City, everybody dressed their very finest to go out and have a good time. Because remember, according to the official historical account, seeking amusement in an active pursuit was a new concept. And so I guess this gamble paid off. This gamble to build these structures and these amusements for these people that were all coming from Manhattan Island to get away from the heat in the summer. And that's why Coney Island was established as it was. And let's not forget that years later, when a young Tom Hanks would go diving off a boat and he would encounter a mermaid. And if you know what film I'm referring to there, please let me know. I know I'm not going to show an image from it. Steeplechase is intriguing as well because it seems to have more of the exhibitionary concept behind it. And when you look in the details, perhaps you could understand or look for an explanation for why you have some of these very intriguing architectural anomalies that are here as part of this park. And of course, many electrical lines from what particular time frame? Was this early 1900s? Was this 1920s? Did this come later? Was the park powered? And indeed, are there other accounts of very unique architecture within this park. And even looking at the beach photo, and you may recall there's been numerous explorations in the past, and most prominently I can think of John Levi referring to looking at how people on the beach seem to be rather lost. No towels, no beachwear. In this particular image, purported to be from the 19-teens or the early 1920s, again another circa image, and yes, anybody can write any date on an image, we seem to see a little bit of an amalgamation here. We have some people that are well dressed and seem out of place, and others who seem to be starting to adapt to life at the beach. And so again, more clues within the photos. Is this just simply a carousel ride, or is this ride and the power that provides it part of some other apparatus that was in existence at the time? And perhaps the story is most compelling with Coney Island because of the fact that there were so many people that were drawn to this particular area. And is it also possible that there really were more remnants here that had to be attended to over time? Because why exactly do you need very well decorated steeples and subsidiary towers on what's just supposed to be an amusement park or a display? Well, you need the stairs and the slide because it needs to look very decorative. Of course, nowadays we just do the very cheap plastic slide and we don't bother with the decorations. And the explanation for it is you don't have a helter-skelter like you did at Luna Park in the early 1900s because we're more efficient towards making money. Now, what happened to these incredible amusement parks in Coney Island? You'll never guess it. It's another story of legacy of fire. And in this case, we have magical dragon fire. This particular display that you're looking at, or this attraction, whatever you want to call it, is Dragon's Gorge. Another part of the Luna Park amusement attractions, and you can see that it's got the very impressive architecture with it, where you would actually go on a ride and you would go and see many different sights. And it featured a ride through a medieval fantasy land where you actually had dragons breathing fire. Kind of reminds me of the Dungeons & Dragons animated intro from the early 1980s. Apparently, though, these dragons really breathing fire, and there are accounts that they really did breathe fire, was not such a good idea. Because this is what caused numerous fires that ultimately burned down all of Luna Park. And there's numerous accounts of these dragons breathing fire. Ah, yes, another example of our favorite cartouche. Why do we need to build the cartouche on an amusement park ride or an attraction? Now, there is a patent for this Dragon's Gorge, interestingly enough, if you want to consider this very rudimentary sketch with some notes and figure number and then a number at the top of it, a patent. I don't know, maybe I'm going to design a patent for Doc Brown's mind reading device from the original Back to the Future movie. You know, I'll only need a single perspective, write some numbers on it, submit it to the patent office, and then I could actually have the patent for that. I'll be sure to call Robert Zemeckis to make sure he's okay with it. But all kidding aside, you think about the establishment of this ride, and then this led to a series of fires. And indeed, in the early 1900s, that's what Coney Island was known for, breaking out in fires all the time. Dreamland, the most impressive of the parks, went up in smoke in 1911. And Luna Park burned down several times, then finally in the 1940s. Again attributed to that Dragon's Gorge attraction, where the dragons were actually breathing fire. So was this fire or was this magical fire? Where was Johnstown Flood? Yes, I'm mispronouncing that quite intentionally for fun. Why didn't they provide water or a flood that could have put out these flames? And it's intriguing to think that once again it's this account of having things that go up in fire. These impressive edifices, this very unique architecture, and indeed this amalgamation of many different mysteries that just quickly went up in smoke. And people say, well, of course it's no mystery. We never figured out how to handle fires. And you look at some of the images of utter destruction and devastation of these amusement parks, and you'll see the same things that we've seen in many of the other images that we've looked at of city destruction across the land. Granted, the Great City Fires are attributed to a timeline that encompasses in some cases over 200 to 300 years, whether we're talking about the Great Fire in London in 1666, or we're talking about the Great Chicago Fire that occurred over 200 years later. Yet something about these events seem to be a little bit more contemporary and a little closer together than we might like to admit. Now again, you could say that's speculation, and you could say that the official timeline that we have is absolutely correct, and it's unimpeachable in questioning it. But when you start to notice certain consistencies, when you start to notice certain things that constantly repeat, whether it's the fires, whether it's the situation of destruction, whether it's the concept of urban renewal or tearing down to rebuild. There's certain patterns that seem to emerge that we can't ignore. And you look at some of the images here, and it really gives you an idea of just how extensive this destruction was, meaning how many structures there really were that were there. I appreciate this particular image because here in the bottom left corner it says, "The first duty of a city is to have a firehouse. Many cities, towns, and villages hesitate to make sufficient appropriation to properly supply their fire departments." And does this continue to be a situation to this day? And why does this continue to be a situation to this day where we struggle with fires? Whether it's a pinpoint fire on a single structure, or we're talking about a massive conflagration that destroys entire cities, amusement parks, or even whole sections of forests and vast landscapes that we just seem to be helpless to do anything about every single time. Very, very impressive structure in the background there, and also giving an idea of the size and immensity of these particular amusement parks prior to their destruction, of course. And why would we have all this rubbling and all this remaining debris if this was just indeed some temporary, cheap construction material? Now, it is possible, and granted, I didn't actually go there walking around the ruins myself to know for sure, but something else that's interesting to me is that we always seem to be able to very well document these fires when they happen and this destruction when it happens. You could also claim that there's more images of destruction than there are of the parks when they were at their functional heyday, and indeed that may be the case. But oddly enough, looking at this particular image, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that we would allow this destruction to continue. We seem to be aware of this, and yet, if we go off the official historical account, we've never seemed to be able to come up with an effective countermeasure to fires. Even with our awareness of it, and even with the advancements of our technology, whether it's our construction technology, our firefighting technology, or the ability to achieve proper command and control with first responders, we always seem to be at a loss whenever these fires occur. And whether it was the early 1900s or even last year, the situation always seems to be the same, and the results are very similar. Vast destruction with the inability to respond. What's really the reason for that? Is there a greater explanation, or is it just simply, it's the will of the people? The people don't want their hard-earned money to support effective countermeasures. Well, as always, I'll leave that conclusion to you. But it is quite an interesting coincidence that these impressive amusement parks with the unique architecture and their impressive legacy of being the very first amusement parks in the United States where people actively sought recreation and amusement went up in smoke, as so many other old world structures have over time, and as so many other accounts relate to over time. Now you can just simply hand wave it away and say, yes, unfortunately things happen. It's just a vast coincidence that all the most impressive structures over time went up in smoke, whether it's the Crystal Palace in the United Kingdom, or any one of the other Crystal Palaces anywhere, or any other of the numerous structures. And believe me, we don't even need to keep a list because we already have a list kept for us. They tell us what went up in smoke. The only thing that we understand is different is when things were destroyed. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? And the legacy of what remained with Coney Island. Steeplechase Park was the only park that survived in the 1960s after the fires. And of course, we may recall that in the 1960s was when the United States was facing the push for urban renewal, the concept of renewing our decaying urban centers. And of course, this led to the unbridled destruction, demolishing of these old city cores that, as we understand, were deteriorating anyway. And you can look here and see the impressive exhibition area of Steeplechase Park. And it's quite an impressive exhibitionary hall, and we'll take a look at its entire size because, once again, you might be surprised to understand just how large this playground of fun or this exhibitionary hall was for Steeplechase Park. Again, it's something else that the sheer gargantuan nature of the size is shocking, and you would expect it to be beyond the capabilities at the time to build something this immense. But apparently this is exactly what we had at Steeplechase Park. and Steeplechase Park being the last amusement park on Coney Island that did survive to the urban renewal time frame of the 1960s. And this incredible exhibitionary hall, or this attraction, or whatever you want to call it, this very large edifice that we think of when we looked at the other World's Fairs and all of their incredible expeditionary halls. Enter a real estate developer named Fred Trump. He looks rather familiar. I'm not exactly sure where I've heard that name before. Fred Trump was a very prominent real estate developer in the 1960s and took it upon himself to try to revive Coney Island, namely through Steeplechase Park. Of course, the efforts to revive Coney Island involved demolishing the Playground of Fun, or that incredible expeditionary hall that we just looked at, as is always the case. Now, apparently there was some real estate deals that went on with Fred Trump, and over time they continued to try to revive the Coney Island amusement park. But for whatever reason, it just never approached the level that it was at the early 1900s. There are still some remnants, though, of some impressive architecture if you go to Coney Island to this day. Some hints at the old world still endures in some particular ways. Unfortunately, though, the most pronounced examples, whether we're talking about either one of the great towers in Dreamland or Luna Park, are no longer with us. But there are still hints and clues that there was impressive architecture that may have been from something before. Or again, it all just may be a big coincidence. And we even have this current high school, Abraham Lincoln High School. No, I'm not making that up. Once again, we have another Abraham Lincoln High School, whether we're in Des Moines, Illinois, or anywhere in the United States, that shows impressive old world architecture. That always seems to be the situation. So perhaps some advice I can give you if you're looking for impressive old world architecture in your neighborhood, if you live in the United States, look for the high school named Abraham Lincoln High School. And if you come across one that's not old world architecture, be sure to let me know. And the incubator babies, new humans. As if we don't have enough reasons to question and explore Coney Island, the main display of incubator babies, or the infant incubators, was in Coney Island. Yes, the mainstream historical account informs us, and you can get an idea of some of this impressive architecture too, where they showcase these infants. And we've explored this before, but what was really going on here? Were these just simply a display to showcase the technology available at the time, that if you had a premature baby that it could survive in an incubator? Let's be generous here and suppose that they did want to showcase that technology. Then why did you need to have so many incubators to showcase this? Wouldn't one single incubator have done the job? And how exactly do you reconcile this with the amusement concept of what Coney Island, or the amusement parks, were supposed to be about? Yes, ride your roller coaster and now go see the incubator babies. And be sure to get a hot dog on your way. And look at this. Before use and after use. Baby incubator, 12 months growth in 1 hour? Now, of course, you would say that this is just simply commercialism, marketing as we'd call it today. Or is this referring to something else? We really have to ask, what's the account with these incubator babies? Were these babies that were brought in from other areas? Or was there something else going on? Is it even possible, and yes, this is going out to the far reaches of explanations, that these were actually entirely new human beings that were being designed from the ground up? An entirely new population of human beings with, dare I say, diminished physical capabilities from the previous generation of human beings? Is that what was really happening here with these incubator babies? Was this the establishment of the new generations that were going to populate this quote-unquote new world? Maybe that's just a far-fetched science fiction concept, and that's all it is. But it's very strange to see these images of these incubator babies. And I'm not showing some of the more bizarre images because they're rather disturbing, but you can certainly look up these images on your own if you're so inclined. But this very strange showcasing, this exhibition of infants and this technology, doesn't seem to reconcile with what we expect with the society at the time. And what's with this individual's headgear? This is a very unique style at the time. And I'd like to close by looking at this Stargate, this portal. What exactly is this that we're looking at? Now, this is associated with the Coney Island exhibitions, and this is stated to have been an electric building. At least that's what the caption says, but when you look at it, there seems to be something much more elaborate behind it. Now, the official caption tells us this is Dreamland, entrance to the electric building. Yes, Dreamland, the first amusement park that went up in smoke. And when we look closely, what do we see? Again, we see these symbols, these cartouches, and these symbols that appear everywhere. Now, was this just supposed to be a temporary building? Or was this a permanent building? And again, I'm trying to reconcile the mainstream account with what's really going on. Because how could you possibly justify this? These incredible obelisks on either side of this with these cartouches on them. Again, were we showcasing our reverence for ancient Egypt and the Roman deities at the time? Or did these represent something else entirely? Because here you can see the mainstay of this cartouche. And again, I get the impression that this is some very elaborate technological device. And no, there are really no other images I could find of this particular apparatus. Is this a Stargate? Is this a portal? Is this some sort of power generation device? Is it more? Or could it be something else entirely? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and by all means, let me know if you've seen other images of this electric building, or the entrance to the electrical building, or the entrance to the Dreamland electric building, whatever it is. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you appreciated this exploration of Coney Island. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Beyond the Great Plains, you come to the eastern face of the Rocky Mountains, and there the dramatic city of Denver. Denver, located in the current state of Colorado in the United States, the capital city of Colorado, and also the largest metropolitan area in the Front Range corridor, an urban complex that runs along the east side of the Rocky Mountains. What's the real story behind Denver? We have many modern high-rises that conceal old-world structures, much as we see in other cities such as Milwaukee. And what's intriguing about Denver is that it had a story of very rapid population growth. It has no shortage of very impressive old-world structures. Once again, another location that grew up very rapidly and was in a very remote area, especially concerning ourselves with the limitations of population and technology of the late 1800s, when the city went through its most dramatic population growth. But what's the real story behind Denver? Why is this one of the most interesting old world areas that we haven't explored just yet? There's many mysteries and many hidden examples of what may be the finest old world architecture, and some stories we haven't examined in the secrets of the Mile High City. We start by looking at the bird's eye view of Denver, and I wanted to get a good look in terms of how it's laid out, and we see an impressive population growth going from 4,700 to 200,000 people in 40 short years, or a 4,300% increase. That's your population increasing by a factor of 44 every 40 years. Now, I understand that Dr. Quinn was in nearby Colorado Springs, but how exactly do they explain all these people flocking to this mountainous area at a time when it was remote and difficult to reach? We see in the early bird's eye view map that there are many impressive structures attributed to construction from after the 1860s up until the 1890s. Now, whether people were coming there for jobs, economic opportunity, or the nearby silver mines, which is what we have a lot of the historical account informing us, or the fact that they knew Dr. Quinn was in Colorado Springs, it is a very impressive and unprecedented growth going off the official historical account. And we have many impressive structures that are depicted on this bird's eye view map. And so it gives us the impression that we have a very intricately built and impressive city. Now, many of these structures are no longer with us, but the fact that they are very well documented, such as the Arapahoe County Courthouse, and it should be noted that Arapahoe County was originally part of Kansas territory, and Denver was actually part of the land that was part of Kansas territory, before it became the separate state of Colorado. Interesting structures, though. Wondrous hotels and other impressive municipal buildings that we would not see the likes of today. And, of course, we understand the reasons. And why not have an opera house, too? The Tabor Opera House, named after Horace Tabor. And what do we have here? A National Mining and Industrial Exposition building? Why not? I mean, it was a very small town. You saw the population numbers for 1870, but we may as well have an exposition. And we see that we have multiple dates written on this. Is this what Denver looked like in the 1860s? Is this a bird's eye view map from the 1880s? Well, make of it what you will. But what I find interesting about these bird's eye view maps is they do correspond with the current layout of all of these cities and towns that we still have around. And of course, we understand that the city was built up around a vast Union Station, the intersection point of many railroads. Although the original Transcontinental Railroad did not pass through Denver, it actually went north through Wyoming, which is why we have that impressive Ames Monument, that little pyramid that's in the ground in Wyoming. What is the story, though, behind Denver with these interesting structures and all these elaborate buildings and this impressive layout that seem to already exist? Now, I'm merely saying that's just what the map makes it look like. Going all the way back to the early history of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when we look at the unfortunate history of the United States westward expansion with what was considered slave states and free states. And you've no doubt read the history of Bleeding Kansas. Well, Kansas did eventually be admitted to the Union as a free state, and then Colorado would fall on. Remember, this is the 1860s. And this is our early dramatic painting, if we will, of what Denver looked like at the start of the 1860s. A bunch of tents, some covered wagons, and some very pretty trees. I really wonder where exactly this artist set up before he painted this very dramatic picture. I mean, it's not like we didn't have photography available in the 1860s or even the 1850s, but this is what we have. We even have this early layout of Denver, and keep in mind, this was before there was really anybody there, and it's very intriguing to me that they already had multiple street names, and even more interesting that we skipped right ahead to 15th Street. Well, maybe they just decided to forego 1st through 14th Street, or perhaps there's more from this map that's not depicted on there. Not really sure what to make of it. There's the usual history that we have of difficulties with natural disasters and other sorts of issues that we have in the other cities that we've explored, and whether we're talking about flooding, fire, Denver is certainly no exception to this. Now, again, remember that the city was built in a very short amount of time. And here in these very early photographs that we do have that are attributed from the archive to the 1860s, we do see some very impressive structures that were already constructed and ready to go. Brick buildings and what looks to be some sort of castle building in the background. I'm sure it was not a castle, it just looks that way. I mean, what are your thoughts on what this structure really is? Why does it have all these interesting little spires on it? What purpose could they possibly serve? Now, there are images that show that Denver was subjected to fire at different points in time from 1870 to 1890. Although, are these fires, or is this some sort of scene that was set up from the film The Day After? I'm not really sure. It's very intriguing. It's hard to know what to make of some of these early images. Ah, yes, and our one image of the mining exposition building. Now, of course, it makes sense. They hadn't really even gotten mining off the ground in the 1870s, but I guess they just had the foresight to know that Colorado, once it did become a state, of course, was going to be the forefront of mining operations, especially off the Rockies. So you may as well build an impressive exposition building off of some new looking railroad tracks. Also interesting that we have coins that commemorate this particular exposition. It was the 1800s, and doing elaborate expositions was just the order of the day. And we understand that all these structures were temporary, and if it was so easy to build such elaborate temporary structures, then why are we still not doing it? Well, maybe we'll get that promised World's Fair coming up in Iowa here in the future. I wouldn't hold my breath, though. And you see some of these other early images that give us the impression that there seemed to be a very developed infrastructure system within Denver. Evidently, they got the trolley off the ground very quickly, and remember that this is out in the westward expansion, or what was still known as the frontier of the United States at that time. But why let a little thing like that keep you from constructing a very elaborate welcome gate? Oh, you know, maybe that's what's missing from cities these days, is we don't have a massive gate on them that says welcome with many operational trolleys and cars. Now we can attribute this to the early 1900s. I like the fact that they have the... Ooh, take a look at that interesting symbol. Now see, that's also what we're missing. Why don't we have interesting symbols like this on our gates? So you just build gates like this and you'll attract people to come to the city, whether there's actually jobs available or not. Although the official history tells us that there was an economic boom in Denver. There was all kinds of jobs from 1900 to 1910. And this attracted immigrants and people everywhere. And that's exactly how we can accept the explanation behind this vast population growth in this very short 40-year period from 1870 to 1910. Now, if you want to do a little fun game with math, calculate what the population of Denver would be today if it continued at this 4,000% population growth. And here we have Horace Tabor, a political party leader, also considered the great silver baron of the area. And he was responsible for starting many silver mines in Leadville and the surrounding area that contributed to the vast economic boom. Although his life wasn't all prosperity, he went from rags to riches to government bureaucrat. Yes, he ended his career as the postmaster general, apparently, of Denver. What an interesting career path, not exactly what you hear about. And when you try to reconcile what was actually going on at that time, yes, we have one individual who's responsible for taking the economic risks of starting all these mines and was very prosperous to the point where he has this wonderful opera house that he apparently built, and then he went broke. We have our early Union Station, our very elaborate train station that was always affiliated with the new cities, apparently, because if you don't have a very elaborate train station, how exactly are people going to want to get off the train and stay in your city? So it all makes sense. I mean, again, I'll ask that question, why aren't we building train stations like this today? Oh, that's right, because we aren't bothering with the high-speed rail in the United States. There's a lot of opposition to it, and it just doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a high-speed rail. But don't worry, Amtrak is getting there. And maybe one day they'll get back to building elaborate structures like this. But looking at the early images that we have, we see our interesting mix of trolleys and other means of transportation in the early 1900s. And we also have the very elaborately constructed buildings. Now, I'm impressed going back to the bird's eye view map of Denver and looking at all the incredible structures that were apparently already built by the 1880s. And you saw the population numbers and how incredible that would really be. Because, once again, the official history informs us that Denver really exploded in terms of population from 1900 to 1910. Everybody just wanted to go there. Because, there weren't buildings built yet, or were there? There were opportunities that were available. Especially with mining, silver mining, lead mining, and who knows what else was around there. Now, granted, it's not known for being an agrarian area, but they did have, of course, the large stockyards, which is rather intriguing. Now, there's a saying in the United States that some of the finest cattle are raised in Wyoming, and then they're sent to Iowa to be processed or to live on the farms. Of course, it depends how you follow the line or the actual lines of logistics. And keep in mind, this is with modern logistics, the interstate system and everything else that we have available in the United States. It's still very impressive, though, that with a limited transportation system, no highways in existence at that time, no interstate system, just the railroad and just horse and cart, they were able to build an incredible city on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Something else I think we need to step back and take a look at, though, is the accounts of destruction that we have with Denver. And there were numerous fires that apparently occurred that are responsible for preventing us from being able to enjoy these wondrous historical buildings that once existed that were displayed so prominently on the bird's eye view map that we looked at. But whether it's an opera house or something else, you can see that within the great theaters there were always examples of impressive architecture and a focus on artwork and, of course, geometric precision. Because remember all those people that we saw in those early photos, and remember this official historical account that we have of these disparate groups of immigrants from different areas. And yes, I'm saying that word a very particular way, disparate, for a reason. Because how exactly do you reconcile the fact that you have all these people from these different backgrounds speaking different languages that were just able to come together very quickly and seem to operate in a very organized manner to rapidly build this city when no city had existed before? Or rather, many of the buildings were lost in the natural disasters. And you may have noticed that in all of our other city explorations, it's the same story beats that we have. The same historical paradigm that we have, where the United States, every single city, managed to have vast population growth, managed to build incredible structures, such as the the Colorado State Capitol in Denver, that we'll be looking at a little bit later, in a very short amount of time. Now, in all the state capitol buildings that we've looked at, we haven't looked at the Colorado State Capitol yet, and has a rather interesting background to it as well. But Oddly enough, it also shares many of the same details that we've come across in the other great cities of the United States. You're thinking about going to the 1800s and trying to put yourself in the mind of whether you're an immigrant from Germany or somebody who's relocating from the South after the United States Civil War seeking economic opportunities. And once again, you're trying to understand why anybody'd want to go to this particular area. How did word of mouth really get out about the job opportunities? Well, maybe there were people going around dispensing flyers saying that, yes, we need to conduct mining here. There's silver mines and there's other opportunities. There's vast amounts of granite that we can actually mine and process here in Colorado and build these great buildings out of. And that may well be true. And indeed, you have the Rocky Mountains nearby, and so there is an explanation of where these construction materials come from. But still, the fact that all of these incredible buildings were already constructed, again going off of the historical evidence that we have in the bird's eye view map, with a very small population, when we understand that the solution for constructing all these buildings was there was just infinite labor available. Now, I'm being facetious when I say infinite labor, but that's usually the explanation that we have. Everybody was an artisan, everybody was a craftsman, every single immigrant, wherever they were coming from, did have this unique skill set. Unless you want to accept the fact that all you need is a good architect, and then an architect can draw these elaborate plans, and anybody, no matter how unskilled they are, could actually put these buildings together. But we see, looking at these late 1800s, early 1900s images of these impressive structures in Denver, that, much like the other cities that we've looked at in the United States, there seemed to be no limits on the kinds of structures that they could rapidly construct. And not only were they beautiful, not only were they gorgeous, but they had some very interesting intricacies to them. Some unique decorative motifs that, once again, we just don't see in our modern architecture. And we understand that to be because we're not inclined to put the effort into artistic expression in our modern architecture. We're also not inclined to build with construction materials because now such construction materials are prohibitively expensive, despite the fact that we have an improved infrastructure. We have an interstate and a highway system that did not exist in the 1890s up until the 1920s, when the vast preponderance of Denver was constructed that we're looking at in these images. So once again, how exactly do we reconcile this? Well, it's because people worked harder back then. It's because there were no regulations. There was no focus on safety. Although if you look at newspaper clippings from 1850 to 1900, you'll find that safety headlines a lot of things. I'll give you the notorious example of the safety of the shot tower in Dubuque, Iowa. Look that one up about how they emphasize safety. And who actually built all these elaborate constructions and why? Was this just simply from the non-existent municipal funds of Denver as a nascent city? Or were there just wealthy people who decided to come in and develop this area? And that's the other explanation that we tend to get. There were people who had a lot of money, and rather than living in the already developed areas such as New York City or even Chicago, after the fire, of course, and they rebuilt it, because recall that when Denver began its massive growth, 1900 to 1910, there was the City Beautiful movement that was going on across the United States. The City Beautiful movement, where they were emphasizing urban planning, and that's the other explanation for why we have all these incredibly gorgeous photos of these cities in the United States from 1900 onward. This was all inspired by the efforts of the Columbian Exposition out of Chicago. We're going to build our cities in a City Beautiful format. And I guess that even applied to your breweries. That's why they look like castles with smokestacks, because you can't have a good brewery anywhere, whether it's in Utah, Colorado, Iowa, West Virginia, without it looking like a castle. How can you be expected to brew good beer unless you have a castle to go to work in every day? But once again, you look at the early images of Denver, and again, you have multiple conflicting impressions from these images. Was it just some sort of western frontier town with a lot of wooden structures? Or was it something much more extensive with all of these impressive granite and red stone structures, or whatever the construction material we have that's attributed to the particular building? And when we see designs such as this, we have seen these in other cities with this interesting layout that, once again, we just simply don't go with in our modern cities because we lack the capability. Or, excuse me, we lack the desire to do so. There's also some interesting images that show horses on carts and actually riding in the carts in front of what would be trolley vehicles. What exactly is going on here? Once again, the explanation is using the vast differences in inclines where Denver's located on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. What you would do is you would have the horses pull the cart where it was needed, or in this case, the trolley vehicle, and then you'd have a little cart in front of it that the horses would ride on. How industrious. Interesting house there as well. But it didn't take them long before they quickly converted all of their trolley cars to operate on the electrical system, and thereby not relying on the poor horses to pull these vast trolley cars all over the place and up and down these inclines, unless of course they rode down the inclines. Isn't it very interesting? And then here looking at an early image of a very modest high school constructed in the 1920s, Denver East. We'll take a closer look at that in a little bit. And once again, you can see that it conforms to our expectations of how high schools were supposed to be in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because if you don't have something that looks like a large castle, how are people supposed to know that they're in a high school? Here in Salida or Salida, Colorado, pronunciations vary, you have the roundhouse of the great rails. I always find these roundhouses impressive, though, because of the vast magnitude of the layout. And just think of what it really took to build these structures. Now also think about the fact that we're operating here in the high elevations of the Rocky Mountains. And recall the limitations on slopes that rail cars and locomotives at that time had to operate under. In other words, the steam engines did not do a very good job of going uphill, so they had to operate on level surfaces. And it's also interesting to note that this wondrous roundhouse here was once again a victim of another fire. Was this an act of negligence or something else? It's hard to say, but we see another example of a fire destroying a very impressive structure that on first glance seems like it would be impervious to fire. Now, trying to reconcile the story of all the infrastructure developments of the railroad with what actually happened in Colorado is very intriguing. I find it very impressive that not only was the Transcontinental Railroad built, going through Wyoming of course, but in the fullness of time, they did lay out all these railroads in Colorado. I mean, you needed to have some means of getting all this silver, all this granite, and all these other incredible materials that you could mine in and around the Rocky Mountains out of there to the more wealthy areas, or at least the more developed areas of the United States at that time. But you once again see the interesting images that show some of the limitations with the railroad. At least until, subsequent images where we see that it's almost as though the railroad became much more advanced and then was abruptly neglected. And of course that time frame conforms with the advent of World War II, apparently, because that's where you'll see most of these advanced locomotives from the 1930s. Ah, yes, Cheeseman Park here in Denver. And we'll take a look at some images of this very impressive neoclassical structure that was in an area that was originally stated to be a cemetery. But then they converted it to a park. Well, that sounds like an all too common story once again, and hopefully not doing a repeat of the film Poltergeist, they didn't neglect not to move the bodies, but who knows for sure. And you can see that much like our other cities, with the old world element of these cities, or the surviving historical buildings, are now being surrounded by these very impressive modern high-rises. And as some people will tell me in the comments, you should appreciate these modern high-rises because they're an example of art. Here we have the Daniels and Fisher Tower, one of these impressive early skyscrapers from Denver, attributed to 1911. And you may recall in some of the other cities, such as Seattle, where we've seen similar towers, this particular tower is no exception. Once again, the ability to build in such a format. Now, I really wonder if the theory goes that there were other larger structures that had to be torn down or removed, because we can see that this particular tower is somewhat more modest than what we'd expect, especially compared to the modern high-rises. We have to ask the question, is it possible that only certain buildings, such as this tower, were designated to survive for whatever reason? And there's a lot of interesting details behind this particular tower. Why exactly was it designated to survive? Why, despite the fact that it's much shorter than the surrounding massive skyscrapers, does it have more detailing in it? Why do we have construction photographs such as this that are, at best, puzzling, and at worst just, well, outright ludicrous? Because what's going on with the sky? Why does the scaffolding not match the construction materials? What exactly is going on right at the divide line right here? Now, I'm not suggesting that this is some sort of fabricated photograph, just that it looks very interesting. The other old world signs that we have for this particular tower, in terms of its different appearance and color, depending on the daylight, something that seems to vary much greater with what we would consider to be old world structures. And then, of course, we have some of the intriguing symbols that we've come across in many other structures. And here in the Daniels Fisher Tower being no exception. We, of course, see our interesting pantheon of gods and goddesses that we seem to have. And, oh, yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our favorite cartouche that makes another appearance here on the front of this balcony area. And why exactly was there this movement and all this artistic expression on these structures in the early 1900s to venerate the classical deities of Greece and Rome? I don't know, maybe it was just a really cool thing at that point in time. Looking at some of the other exterior architecture, though, you can see that it does seem to be sectional in a way, but it's still impressive that it is in a what appears to be modular construction format, because imagine laying out all these different pieces and putting this together. Now, in some of the older images, we do have some clues in terms of how ornate and impressive this particular structure really was at one point in time. Here, looking at the ceiling of this particular room, and we see the incredible decorative elements that we've come to expect in genuine old world structures. We also see the layout here at the, what I'm guessing is the baseline or the main gallery of this particular structure. And we see floors that go up. So I wonder if there is much more of a story that's been lost over time with this particular building. Because it seems as though it's been renovated many times and there's been vast changes to it. And of course we can see how the base department store and the tower itself has been changed over time. Was there also some details that were lost with the original bell tower that always seem to be included with these structures? And again, going back to the theory, what if there were other taller, more elaborate buildings that just simply had to be brought down or didn't survive whatever events transpired in the 1800s that we may not know the exact details behind? Again, it's just a theory. But in this particular image, again, you have hints in terms of how opulent and impressive this structure really was. And yes, I say opulent because it should and could have been prohibitively expensive at that time. There were vast economic limitations in 1911. The Federal Reserve hadn't even been started yet. Now let's take a look at Denver East High School, 1924. Now this is attributed to the Roaring Twenties, so at least we have some consistency with the economic prosperity going on at that time, and Denver being no exception to wanting to build impressive castle high schools. Now this is the earlier structure that was Denver East High School from the 1800s, and we can see that it is very impressive and well laid out. Maybe that's the reason why we have struggles with high schools in the United States, because we don't build them in terms of these opulent castles anymore, or opulent chateaus, or whatever you want to call them. It's without pier, settlement, or crack in its walls. So that's no doubt why they had to tear it down and replace it with this beauty in the 1920s. It was without pier and it had no structural defects. That's the perfect reason for why you need to knock a building down and replace it. Because obviously you have no economic limitations. That's why I always find that whole debate about the fact that, well, we just don't have the money to do anything today. I don't want to hear that. I really don't. And when we look at Denver East High School, we can see that it contains a little Michelangelo modification there, or at least a scale model that is covered up so it's appropriate for the students in high school, until they're supposed to learn about such things. An interesting exterior ground, too, with the Denver High School, where we see other monuments. And then looking at the interior, and much like the building that we just looked at, we see the same story within this high school. We have hints about how incredibly decorative and wondrous this structure really was in the past. Now, are there older images? Yes, there are, that do give us that impression that this really was a much more ornate and elaborate structure, especially on the interior, than we're giving it credit for. Now, in our explorations, we're well aware of the fact that these, what we classify as old world buildings, have difficulties with surviving intact and unmodified to the modern day. Now, once again, the official explanation behind that is that these buildings were so poorly built when they were erected, even though they say that they're without pier and that they have no cracks and no structural defects, they needed to be modified, they needed to be renovated relentlessly. And that's why we don't see these incredible reading rooms, these libraries, and these auditoriums from these buildings that are high schools that we were somehow able to easily construct in the 1920s. I know, it was the roaring 1920s. Yes, it was after the Great War, and it was before the other Great War, World War I and World War II, and it was at a time of economic prosperity for the United States, which would end just as rapidly as it began. But don't worry, it wouldn't stop people from building impressive structures. I mean, how could you have a high school without a cool clock tower like this, and a very interesting cupola with a dome? And then even looking at the exterior grounds, we have other questionable elements, such as this interesting fountain. And what exactly is this constructed out of? Is this what we would think of as modern concrete? Is this Portland cement? Or is this something else entirely? Have they ever had to renovate any of these structures? Have they had to renovate this entry gate? Is this a newer entry gate? Or is this just an older surviving piece of the original high school? And what exactly is with this interesting lion motif? And we have the Denver City and County building constructed in 1932, and this, of course, attributes to our construction capabilities even during the Great Depression in the United States. So, how badly was Denver hit by the Great Depression? Well, apparently not badly enough that it would preclude the construction of this city and county building. And we can see that this city and county building is very impressive on the exterior. Apparently, they inform us that when this construction was originally done, it had to be short enough so it wouldn't block the view from the Colorado State Capitol from seeing the mountains. How interesting, given the fact that the entire city is surrounded by mountains, that they had such a constraint. Isn't that a lovely obelisk in the foreground there? And so, when you see images such as this, it sort of goes against what your expectations for Denver would be. Now, I'll admit the very first time I ever saw Denver was in the opening credits of the old TV show Dynasty. Yes, that was the very first time I ever saw Denver in any way, shape, or form. I hadn't been there before. For whatever reason, in the travels in my life, I've only ever gone to the airport. Yes, don't worry, we're getting to that. But I never really got on the ground much in Denver before. And it is quite intriguing to me how we have this city that you would think, especially at the time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, was isolated in the mountains, and yet it had this incredible explosive growth. Now, of course, you would just attribute that to the fact, well, the entire United States was going through incredible explosive growth from 1890 to 1920. And not just in Denver, but everywhere. So if I were an immigrant coming into the United States, what exactly would draw me to Denver? Why wouldn't I go to New York City? Why wouldn't I go to Chicago? Why wouldn't I go get my free plot of land in North Dakota, South Dakota? Get myself a farm in Iowa? The point being, there's many other opportunities available. You could really go anywhere. So it's very interesting to me to try to deconflict that. Now, of course, we look at the earlier Arapahoe County Courthouse from the 1800s, and we can see a very impressive structure. And for whatever reason, I'm going to go online and say that this seems to be an even more impressive structure than the city and county building that we just looked at. Why would anybody ever want to tear something like this down? Well, of course, you can look at the official historical account and you'll understand that there were apparent structural defects with this, that there were other issues, that it just wasn't going to be suitable for the needs of such a rapidly growing city. Yes, imagine if we still were able to build structures like this, and it even includes a nice little statue on the top of it. And I suppose this statue is going to be attributed to something such as mining. I'll only show one image here showing the tragic destruction of this building, demolition of this building, and it occurred in the 1930s. I guess it wasn't part of urban renewal. There's many other structures to observe in Denver, such as hotels, and I recall our exploration of Hotel Tartaria a couple months ago, and once again we have these unique castles that became hotels, or chateaus, or whatever name you want to call them, manors even. Wonderful turrets and great chimneys and very intricate construction. Were these purpose-built as hotels, or did they have some other incipients in their origin story? Could it be that there's some other purpose behind these structures that we don't fully understand or comprehend? And whatever names we assign to these hotels, and this is just a perfunctory look at Denver overall, whether it's the Windsor Hotel or all these other names that we have for these hotels that seem to repeat many times, much as the town names repeat many times across the United States, what's the real story behind it? And there's even some stories of perhaps some very interesting paranormal phenomenon that occurs within these hotels. Yes, the visibility and the appearance of ghosts that have been reported. Now, are ghosts real? Are they simply a product of our imagination? Is it some sort of reality breakdown? Or is it just simply in the mind of the humorist and it's all a Ghostbusters situation? It's hard to say. I certainly can't write it off, though, because there are far too many reports to simply ignore. And it's interesting that they're always associated with these old world structures. Could it be possible that there's another dimension or even another function to these old world structures that we don't fully understand or comprehend yet? Is that the reason why we see these elaborate hotels in every location? And it is amazing to me that in every single city and town, even the most subtle of hotels, had a lot more grandeur that was associated to it. And I know the explanation will be it was just because the nation and the people at that time valued artistic expression. We just don't today. Ah, yes, we have a mining exchange building. Because remember, this is in the middle of mining country, so why wouldn't you have a mining exchange building? Consider all the grain exchange buildings and the cotton exchange buildings and every other exchange building that we have. Very interesting designs on the top of this particular structure. Little triangle and, of course, another little statue. Does that guy have a pickaxe or does he have something else? And the University of Denver, and yes, our great universities everywhere across the land with some of their very impressive structures. Is this an old main building with a smokestack in the back? If I was just looking at the structure, would I think this might be a brewery? Well, prior to doing these explorations, I never would have thought it was a brewery, but now, yeah, I could actually see it being a brewery. What exactly is the construction material on many of these buildings in the University of Denver? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the exact nature and the origin dates of these buildings, but it is interesting just to walk on any university, any college campus, or heck, if you find one of those old military schools nearby, and yes, they're all over the nation, they're not just in the South, as some people would have you believe, it's intriguing to think about how they're able to build such structures. Now, have some of these structures been modified or changed or renovated or part of urban renewal over time? Maybe. I mean, why doesn't every stadium have a lovely tower like this? And even if this has been modified or built in more recent times, it is very lovely and very intriguing. And that's the interesting thing about universities. There has been some renewal and change done over time. Was this an original building? Is this a building that's an amalgamation of old world and, how do we say, fifth era construction techniques? It may be possible. And again, we're just doing an overview. The Red Rocks Amphitheater, a project of the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. The New Deal strikes again. So when you have a Great Depression going on and you have many people out of work, you create work for them. And who better to do that than the federal government of the United States? And through the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, which provided labor and also materials apparently, they decided to build this impressive amphitheater here on the west side of Denver in this very impressive rock formation. Now, this rock formation has had many different names. You'll see these names repeat in places like Colorado and, frankly, all over the nation. Garden of the Gods, Garden of the Titans, or Castle Rock this and that. And it should be noted, you can see why people would think such things. Is there a deeper story, though, behind these interesting rock formations? Or are they just natural rock formations that are very dramatic, and because people needed work, and remember, if you ever watch the TV show Suits, you'll see the character Harvey oftentimes justify his morally questionable actions by saying it was all in the name of jobs. You can understand why a city such as Denver was able to carve itself out of this rather empty plain area on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Or maybe you don't understand it. Maybe it just doesn't make a lot of sense. How is it that it went from nothing to this in 60 short years? That's an impressive amount of development. Every single structure, every road, every railroad, everything that was laid out where there was nothing. And a population that today is nearly 750,000, and no, that is nowhere close to the number that you'd have if you had that 4,000% growth that continued hypothetically until 2040. I'm serious, calculate that number. It's rather eye-opening what the population of Denver would be today if that percentage of growth continued, as it did from 1870 to 1910. Very, very impressive, though, this amphitheater. And there's something else that's unique to Denver, the U.S. Mint in Denver. And we really haven't explored any of these mint buildings before, and I thought this was an opportunity to take a look at it. Now, it should be noted that on this postcard here, this is just a representation, we're looking at the U.S. Mint and how it's laid out with other impressive structures, to include the Colorado State Capitol. And it's just this modest building, it appears. And this is where they mint the coinage from the U.S. Treasury. And yet, looking on the interior of this building, you see something that you would not expect to see in a building that's simply used to mint coins. Once again, impressive geometric precision and artistic expression. Why exactly would this ever be needed in a mint building that's purpose is simply to create coins? Now, when you look up a lot of the public images of the U.S. Mint in Denver, you will see that they're very limited, such as this particular image. It doesn't really give you an idea of the entire layout of the building. And from the exterior, to be fair, it is a rather modest-looking building. But once again, when you look at the details, you get the impression that there's a lot more to it. It does seem to compare to some of those early 1900s courthouses and structures that we've looked at with all other sorts of different purposes across the land. Not just the United States, but Europe and everywhere else for that fact. What exactly is this exterior construction material? Because it does have some very fine detail to it. And you'll see it in random places all over the nation. And of course, they're always assigned to government buildings of some sort of purpose. They are post offices, they are courthouses. Well, in this particular case, we have a U.S. Mint building. That's part of the Department of the Treasury. And so, since this is our first look at a mint building, we need to look at the architect, Mr. James Knox Taylor, first supervising architect of the United States, appointed under the Civil Service, or whatever we were calling it at that point in time. Ah, yes. So, once again, we have an architect. We have an architect who is responsible for many structures. And if you look up this particular individual, when you have a name like Knox, that's just, a path to success. I could even argue it's more than McDonald's is a path to success in the United States. And this Knox had his own entire crew of architects. Ah, yes. These look like the kind of individuals that would just get out on the ground and be doing this kind of hard work themselves. Or at least I could say there's actually an entire team who are laying out designs. And this individual has many buildings associated to him beyond just the U.S. Mint in Denver, and here we're actually seeing the entire modest building. Although when you look at the details, it's not quite so modest. And especially when you look at the interior, once again, it's not really what we'd expect for a building that's designed as to mint coinage, right? But there's other structures, such as this post office here in Mineral Wells, Texas, or is it Mineral Works, Texas? Anyway, town in Texas, where we have this very impressive post office. That's also attributed to this impressive architect. And it also has the slant construction style at that time. Why not? And why stop there? He's also responsible for this impressive post office in San Francisco. That is to this day used as the 9th Circuit Court. Federal court. Yes, always the impression for what these buildings are going to become. If it's a post office, it can be a great courthouse building. Why not? But why stop there? We have this impressive post office in Buffalo, New York. Again, attributed to the same architect and his team. But again, a little bit more of a credible historical account because it's not one architect. No, he's not E. Townsend Mix. He had a team helping him. Why exactly did he need a tower with elaborate ornation on that in Buffalo? I don't know. Even a post office in the relatively small and isolated town of Creston, Iowa, in Union County. Don't get me wrong, they got a great county fair down there, but why exactly did they need a post office like this in the early 1900s in Creston, Iowa? Well, it's no longer a post office, it's now commercial space, so there you go, the signs of progress. And going back to the U.S. Mint in Denver, what exactly do we see on the interior? This is not what we'd expect at all. This incredible beauty in these corridors, this main gallery with these unique and impressive lights. This is just supposed to be a treasury building. And at that time, given the fact that hard currency money was the only means of financial transactions, wouldn't just having a garrison building easily guarded make more sense? there's also these interesting murals that are featured inside of this Mint building in Denver. And they represent interesting things. Trading, mining, commercialism, I guess, if you want to associate it with that. Looking at the front, though, with that sign there, United States Mint, and then comparing and contrasting what you have with these actual figures, the layout of the blocks and the stones, and even the very fine surface on these individual blocks. I wonder, is it possible for anybody to do something like this today? Could a contractor do that? Let's look at some random and old and new structures in Denver. And here, going back to Cheeseman Park, where we have this random, what we'd probably phrase as a neoclassical structure over what was apparently a cemetery, or designated to be a cemetery. There were some issues, though, with this cemetery, and I guess they just decided to transition it to a park. I mean, why not? If you went to the trouble of building a structure like this, I mean, nothing says park like this random neoclassical structure, or whatever architectural terminology we want to associate with it. And if this was in Scotland, we'd probably refer to this as a folly. Or maybe we'd say it's a national monument we were building for veterans that we just ran out of money for. Ah, yes, and some other interesting monuments in Denver. Yes, I'm not exactly sure what these initials or symbols stand for, but it's just very, very interesting. And of course, looking at those symbols across the top, we have encountered those symbols in some other locations before, but for some reason it's just escaping my memory. Oh, and on the topic of monuments, the Tower of Memories, constructed in the 1920s, a very incredible mausoleum. Yes, this is just the kind of effort you would expect to see people putting into a mausoleum. Well, once again, it was the roaring 1920s, so I suppose the economic situation suits that construction, and if it was built during the 1930s, we could attribute it to the 1930s. This is apparently a cable car building with a nice smokestack on it. And even this structure, attributed to the early 1900s, we can see has a lot of impressive architectural detailing on it. And like all the other structures in Denver, it is hidden amongst the modern, impressive commercial buildings. And we would be lost if we didn't have an equitable building. Yes, this is referred to as the equitable building. Another building that was apparently very equitable, that was easily constructed at that point in time. Now again, I'll ask, could anybody lay out a building like this today? No. I'll tell you what we're laying out today. Structures such as this. Ah, yes. Modern architectural wonders. Now, I'm going to give them a little bit of credit on this particular structure in Denver because at least they're trying to decorate the simple glass exterior by putting some sort of facading around it. Although I've got to admit it reminds me of some kind of hive mind for some reason, but maybe that's just me. Oh, yes, and the Wells Fargo Center. Everything's always a Wells Fargo Center to this day in many different cities. So much detail in this building, and so impressive the amount of effort that they went into in laying this out. I mean, look, they have a couple curves on the top of it. I'm impressed. Maybe you are too. So Denver's gone through a lot of change since its initial settlement and rapid population explosion in the very early 1900s. Going from this modest police car to this very interesting structure here in the background. And again, I'd really like to figure out exactly what kind of material it's constructed out of. I know it's in Colorado, it should be granite, such as the Colorado State Capitol, built from 1886 to 1903, and I add a question mark because there are numerous conflicting accounts on the construction of the Colorado State Capitol. And it should be noted that their dome, they changed it from copper to gold. And as we learned in the state of Iowa, gold is very cheap. In fact, it's cheaper to build with gold than to paint with gold. So obviously, gold is cheaper than copper. But we have early images of this Colorado State Capitol whenever it was actually constructed because, as I said, it's a little difficult to discern from the historical accounts. Some say it was built in the early 1890s. Others say it was from 1886 to 1903. Did they build it in different pieces, components? It's hard to say. But we can see that there are impressive structures around it in some of the early photographs. And so I guess if we're going to compare the Colorado State Capitol to the Iowa State Capitol, while it may not have 5 domes, it does have a lot of impressive structures around it, not the shacks that we saw around the Iowa State Capitol. And of course, it's built up on a hill like every other single state capitol seems to be. And here we can see what appears to be the early copper dome. Although, was it actually copper at this point in time, or was it something else? It's hard to say. But that's what the official historical account tells us, is that they originally built the top out of copper. the work of architect Elijah E. Myers. And you may recall that Mr. Myers here is attributed to other state capitals, such as Michigan and Texas, that we've explored before. And, once again, if you have an architect, that's really all you need. And again, there's other conflicting accounts about this individual laying out the plans for the Colorado State Capitol, and then other individuals that had to follow on and complete the work. Which is very interesting, because wouldn't there be disharmony in the construction of the structure? Well, the answer is absolutely not. We've got numerous examples of impressive cathedrals and other wondrous structures that were built across Europe over a period of 100 years. So, in under 20 years, it would be easy to do this Capitol building. You could always get E. Townsend Mix on speed dial and have him come over and finish the architectural plans behind this building. And like I said, in a lot of the earlier images that we have of the Colorado State Capitol, there are other impressive structures that are around it. And if you go out there today and take a look, it is very interesting how the landscape appears. Oh, this is nice. Erected in the 1850s, the old Capitol building. You see, that's what we'd expect. But old Capitol building of what? Colorado wasn't a state in the 1850s. Is that just some sort of joke? I mean, and it's not like the Iowa State Capitol that was originally in Iowa City, and then they moved it to the temporary building in Des Moines, and then they built their impressive state capitol. And we do have some construction images of the Colorado State Capitol that I think should alleviate any crazy theories that we have about a different origin behind this building. I don't see any issues with any of these impressive construction photos. I certainly don't see any scaling issues with these individuals and the actual cupola of the dome, and I'm sure you don't either. This all makes complete and perfect sense, much like the early construction images that we have of, say, the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania. Because why not? Always interesting, though, how we have the baseline constructed first and then the dome constructed second. So in other words, the photos are showing us that you build from bottom to top. Well, that makes sense, does it not? Except for churches in Omaha, where we could build them from top to bottom, after we remove the ground, of course. Looking on the interior, though, of the Colorado State Capitol, you'll see that there is the beautiful ornate detail. And none of the construction photos show the actual interior construction, much like in every other situation that we have, because, well, it would just be boring, difficult, and prohibitively expensive to get photos of the interior construction, I suppose. How exactly was the cupola and the interior of the dome laid out? Now, we've looked up at many domes in our explorations over time. And how do you feel that the interior of the Colorado State Capitol dome compares with some of the other domes that we've looked at? And, I'll go back to building number 1 in this channel, the Iowa State Capitol. Remember what we get when we look at that dome. But I'm not selling the Colorado State Capitol short in any way, shape, or form. It is incredibly beautiful, especially on the exterior, where we see the multiple colors that are always exposed whenever we look at old world buildings in different lighting conditions. And yes, I'll go on record and say it. If you want a successful, long-lasting marriage, I suggest you get married in an old world building, because those seem to be the marriages that really last. It's a bit of a joke, and at the same time, it's a little serious. And of course, you have to understand that the great lawmakers of the United States and any state can only make actual laws with authority if they're doing so in a very beautiful and ornate building. It all makes total sense, and this is why the vast amounts of taxes collected need to be devoted to constructing these impressive buildings. And again, go back to that construction photo that we had. Now, maybe they were just building like a scale model of the Colorado State Capitol. Maybe they were just testing it. Maybe there's some other inconsistency with the construction photo. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with explanations. We do understand, though, that there's an abundance of granite and other construction materials that are available nearby, so perhaps that's not as difficult of an explanation to accept in the great state of Colorado. But it's still very interesting when we look at this material and reconcile where it is. And we'll look at the Denver Airport in 1994, and you're probably asking, why are we looking at the Denver Airport? This is very much not an old world structure, and I would agree completely. But it just so happens that there are a lot of theories that people aren't supposed to have that are associated with this airport. And it really begins with this dedication plaque here, or monument, or whatever we want to call it, Denver International Airport. I don't know what that sign is. I've seen it before. I'm not really sure what it represents. March 19th, 1994. Can anybody tell me what the heck the New World Airport Commission is? I tried to look up that organization and I couldn't find it anywhere. It's just very interesting. Does anybody know what the New World Airport Commission is? And out in front of the Denver International Airport, you have Lucifer. Yes, the blue Mustang, who looks like some kind of horse that's come right from the 9th level of hell, to include glowing eyes. Now, you have to ask this question. This structure was built in 1994, and there's all sorts of theories that are associated to it. For example, is there something very strange going on with this airport? Does this airport connect into some sort of strange underground transportation system? Or is it all just an impressive coincidence? Why on earth would anybody put a horse that looks like this out in front of an airport? You almost get the impression that this is one of those things that's designed to draw our attention. Well, it certainly does get our attention, and that's why I'm devoting attention to it. I mean, really, I could even say this looks like one of those zombie horses that was ridden by the White Walkers in Game of Thrones before that show went right off the cliff. But very, very interesting and impressive sculpture or statue or whatever you want to call it. And as we understand it, the number of quote-unquote conspiracy theories that are associated with the Denver airport, the airport actually takes them in stride and has fun with it. I mean, looking at this particular mural here, what are we supposed to make of this? Well, maybe we need to get Mark Singer on speed dial or add to our contact lists and call him because we need help. There is also interesting murals that have been displayed within the Denver airport at some point in time, and I'm not exactly sure what they're supposed to represent. Now, again, going back to that idea, is this just something that's designed to draw our attention? And was that really the intention behind all this? Something just to keep our eyes focused on so we're not looking elsewhere? I don't know why, but that mural always reminds me of the film Wizards, the 1970s animated one. Apologies for the noise, it takes really big drills to get to the underworld. I can't imagine what particular theories they're embracing here. Is there some kind of salamander people that they're actually employing to work here? I'm not really sure. There are other odd sculptures, such as this really bizarre gargoyle popping out of your suitcase. This gives me an idea for a plot for a new movie. A gargoyle that hides in your suitcase and pops up and terrorizes people. We'll see if there's the film called The Suitcase Gargoyle. I mean, it would be an original idea, so we'd never see it. And then looking at some of these other murals, what exactly do these represent? Or are these just simply designed to be as, how shall we say, strange and as bizarre as possible to gain our attention? And is that really the purpose behind this? Much like it's the purpose behind a particular area that has a number after it. 51? Or is it 52? Just kidding. But these murals are always very intriguing. And I ask you to compare these to some of the murals that you see in the U.S. Mint in Denver. And really compare and contrast what's being expressed. I mean, what do you think these images represent? Do they represent anything, or are they just free artistic expression? Do we just like to remind people that there could be a really bizarre gargoyle that pops up in your luggage after you get it from baggage claim? And one thing I'll say about the Denver airport is the times I've flown through there, I have never really had a good experience, but maybe that's just me. In fact, one of my longest layovers because of flight delays occurred in the Denver airport. So what exactly is going on with these murals? Are they really just there to be the free-form artistic expression? Is this just simply a place that we're supposed to fix our attention to? Or is there something to these theories that people will assign to conspiracies that are labeled on this place? And why don't more organizations just have fun with conspiracy theories? Well, let me tell you about the ultimate conspiracy theory with Denver Airport, and that's the presence of Elway's Steakhouse. Yes, John Elway, the heroic quarterback of the Denver Broncos, who opened his own steakhouse in Denver Airport. Yes, this is the place you want to eat. And you even have an image of the man himself with a great steak right here, and I can tell you that this would be a place that I would want to eat at no point in time. Actually, I did go eat there when I was stuck, and it was probably the best part of the experience. Unlike the steakhouse of a certain quarterback in Green Bay. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.